On the morning of 27 September 1994, the village of Luniha in the Moscow region was met with cries. Vasily Kuzmich, a 62-year-old shepherd, was walking through an old oak grove on the outskirts of the village at dawn to drive out his cattle when he saw something that made him fall to his knees and begin to cross himself. 3 bodies hung from the massive branches of a century-old oak tree. 3 men, neatly hanged, each on a separate branch, swayed in the morning breeze. The ropes were strong, the knots professional, the faces of the dead frozen in grimaces of horror and surprise. They were Kosoy, Grib, and Pasha Koratish, 3 local alcoholics who were feared and hated in the village. The night before, on 26 September, the 3 had beaten 25-year-old pregnant saleswoman Anna Boyko half to death for refusing to give them vodka on credit. This is a story about how, in a crumbling country where the law no longer worked and the police were powerless or indifferent, one man took justice into his own hands. It is a story of revenge, justice, and the price paid for it. It is a story that the residents of the village of Luniha still remember, some with horror, others with understanding. The village of Luniha was located 70 kilometers north of Moscow, in the Dmitrovsky district of the Moscow region. In the early 1990s, it was a typical dying village. Of the 200 houses that stood here in the 1970s, fewer than 80 were inhabited by 1994. The rest stood with broken windows, collapsing roofs, and overgrown gardens. Young people left for the cities, the elderly died, and those who remained tried to survive in a new reality that no one understood and for which no one was prepared. The Soviet Union had collapsed 3 years earlier, in 1991, but for villages like Luniha, little had changed. The collective farm had fallen apart even earlier. The land had been abandoned, the livestock sold off or slaughtered, and the equipment stolen. There was no work. Pensions were irregular, meager, and devalued by inflation. People lived off their gardens and kept chickens and cows if they could. Men went to Moscow to earn money, some on construction sites, some as porters, some as security guards. Women traded in markets, cleaned, and babysat other people's children. The connection with the outside world was maintained by a bus that ran to the district center twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. Almost no one had a telephone at home, and the post office worked once a week. Electricity was cut off regularly, sometimes for a whole day. There was a medical center in the village. Still, the paramedic, an older woman named Klavdia Semenovna, had only a basic education and could only help with colds or minor injuries. In severe cases, it was necessary to travel to the district center, which was 20 kilometers away on a rough road. In the center of the village, at the intersection of 2 dirt roads, stood the only working store, a wooden shack measuring 3 by 4 meters, once painted blue, but now peeling, with a cracked window taped up with duct tape. Inside was a counter and a few shelves with a minimal assortment of goods: bread, which was brought in from the district center 3 times a week, canned food, pasta, cereals, cigarettes, matches, vodka, and cheap wine. Everything else had to be bought in the city. The kiosk was run by Anna Boyko, 25, the wife of Ivan Boyko, a local forestry worker. Anna was born in a neighboring village, worked on a dairy farm after school, then got married and moved to Luniha. Short, plump, with a round, kind face and light hair braided into a plait, she was a quiet, calm woman who never raised her voice and tried to help everyone. Many people came to the shop not so much to shop as to talk. Anna always listened, sympathized, and gave advice. By the fall of 1994, Anna was 6 months pregnant. It was her first child, and she was eagerly awaiting its arrival. Her belly was already large, and it was difficult to move. But she did not quit her job at the kiosk. She needed the money. Her husband did not earn much, and every penny counted. The district consumer cooperative, which formerly owned the kiosk, paid Anna a salary of 200,000 rubles a month, which by September 1994 was a ridiculous amount, barely enough for the bare necessities. Anna worked from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., 7 days a week. She opened the stall, sold goods, wrote down who bought what in a notebook, counted the takings in the evening, locked up, and went home. The Boyko house was 500 meters from the stall, a small wooden hut with 2 rooms, a stove for heating, and a well in the yard. They lived modestly, but Anna was happy. She loved her husband, was expecting a child, and dreamed of the future. But in the village of Luniha, there was something that poisoned the lives of everyone else. A trio of local alcoholics whom everyone knew and feared. They had different names in official documents, but in the village everyone knew them only by their nicknames: Kosoy, Grib, and Pasha Korotish. Kosoy, Viktor Mikhailovich Sukhorukov, 42 years old, a repeat offender with 3 convictions for theft, robbery, and hooliganism. He received his first sentence in 1972, at the age of 20, for burglary of a store in the district center. He served 3 years, got out, and a year later stole a motorcycle again, another 4 years. In 1983, he attacked a man with a knife in a drunken brawl, nearly killing him. He was given 7 years. He was released in 1991 under an amnesty and returned to the village. He got the nickname Kosoy because of an eye injury he sustained in prison. His right eye was covered with a white film and looked to the side, which gave his face a constantly angry, twisted expression. Tall, thin, with uncombed hair and yellow teeth, Kosoy was the recognized leader of the trio. He lived alone in a crooked hut on the edge of the village, did not work, and lived on odd jobs, helping someone dig gardens, carrying firewood. But most of the time, he drank. Grib, Gennady Petrovich Mukin, 38 years old, got his nickname because of his appearance: short, fat, with a large round head and a short torso. From a distance, he really resembled a mushroom. He had 1 criminal record, but it was a serious one. In 1986, while working at a factory in the district center, he stole a batch of tools from the warehouse and tried to sell them. He was sentenced to 4 years. After prison, he returned to the village where his mother lived, an older woman who was afraid of her son, and kept quiet when he brought his drinking buddies home, caused disturbances, and beat her. Mushroom was a vicious drunk. When sober, he was calm and subdued, but under the influence of alcohol, he became aggressive, got into fights, and threatened people. Pasha Korotish, Pavel Viktorovich Zimin, 35 years old, the youngest of the trio, but the most dangerous. He had 2 convictions: for rape in 1981, when he was 22, for which he was given 8 years, and for assault in 1989, for which he was given another 3 years. He was released in 1992. He got his nickname because of his height, 5'3", but he was strong and muscular, with short arms and broad shoulders. He had an evil, narrow face, a permanent smirk, and black eyes that looked at you with some animalistic malice. Pasha lived with his brother, who worked as a tractor driver in a neighboring village and was rarely at home. Pasha did nothing but drink and terrorize those around him, begging for cigarettes and money, demanding alcohol, and making threats. This trio kept the village in fear. They usually appeared in the evenings, already drunk, going from house to house, knocking, demanding money, food, vodka. Older people locked themselves in, afraid to go out. If there were several young men, they could chase the trio away, but individually, they preferred not to get involved. Everyone knew that these people were convicts, that they had nothing to lose, and that they were capable of anything. There was no police station in the village. The nearest one was in the district center, 20 kilometers away. The local police officer came once a month, formally walked around the town, recorded complaints, but did nothing. When asked about the trio, he replied that until a crime had been committed, there was nothing he could do, and that if they were causing trouble, the victims should file a report, but no one did out of fear of retaliation. Anna's kiosk was particularly targeted. The trio came there almost every day, demanding goods on credit: cigarettes, vodka, bread. Anna always refused. The district accounting office strictly forbade selling goods on credit. The store was already unprofitable, debts were growing, and if you add to that the indebtedness of alcoholics who would never pay, the kiosk would close. Anna explained this calmly and politely, but the trio wouldn't listen. They insulted her, banged on the window, and threatened to destroy the kiosk. But Anna stood her ground. She closed the window, locked herself inside, and waited for them to leave. Usually after shouting and making noise, they would go to look for alcohol elsewhere. But the tension was growing. Kosoi told Anna several times that she would regret it, that they would show her that she didn't understand who she was dealing with. Anna didn't pay any attention to this. She was used to threats and knew that drunks often threaten, but rarely follow through. She was wrong. 26. September 1994 was a typical Tuesday. The day was cloudy, cold, and drizzly. Anna opened the stall at 8 in the morning, as usual. About 20 people came in during the day. Some for bread, some for cigarettes, some for groats. The takings were small, but that was normal for weekdays. By 6 in the evening, it was already getting dark. The rain intensified, and dirty streams flowed along the dirt road. Anna wanted to close the stall early at 6:30 because she was feeling unwell. Her back hurt, her stomach ached, and she wanted to go home, lie down, and rest. She began counting the takings, writing them down in a notebook, and preparing to close. At that moment, 3 men approached the stall: Kosoi, Grib, and Pasha Koratish. All 3 were already drunk, staggering, talking loudly, and interrupting each other. Kosoi knocked on the window with his fist and shouted for Anna to open up. Anna went to the window, opened it, and asked what they wanted. Kosoi said they wanted 3 bottles of vodka, that they would take it on credit and pay tomorrow. Anna replied that she didn't give credit, as always. If they had money, fine. If they didn't, sorry. Kosoi got angry. He started shouting that she didn't consider them human beings, that they had had a difficult childhood, that they had fought for their country, and that they had a right to respect. Anna tried to explain that it wasn't her decision, that the accounting department had ordered it, that she couldn't break the rules, or she would be fired. Grib, who was standing nearby, began banging on the wall of the kiosk, shouting that she was a fat cow, that she was greedy, that they would show her. Pasha was silent, just looking at Anna with his black eyes, smiling maliciously. Anna was frightened. She closed the window, locked it from the inside with a hook, and said the stall was closed. They had to leave, or she would call the police. Kosoi laughed, asked what police, saying the police were 20 kilometers away, and that by the time she got to the phone, they would have already done their business. The 3 of them began to rock the stall. The wooden structure creaked and swayed. Anna grabbed the counter inside to keep from falling. She screamed for them to stop, but they just laughed and rocked harder. Then Pasha ran to the door of the stall, an old wooden door on hinges, locked from the inside with a latch. He began kicking it, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th kick, the latch gave way, and the door swung open. Pasha burst inside. Anna tried to retreat into the corner, screaming that he shouldn't touch her, that she was pregnant. Pasha grabbed her by the arm and pulled her toward the door. Anna resisted, struggling to break free, but he was stronger. Kosoi and Grib entered the store and began grabbing items from the shelves: bottles of vodka, cigarettes, canned goods, stuffing them into their pockets and bags. Anna screamed and tried to push Pasha away. He got angry, swung his arm, and punched her in the face. The blow was decisive, and Anna fell, hitting her back on the counter and then on the floor. Pasha began kicking her in the side, stomach, and back. Anna covered herself with her hands, screamed, begged him to stop, and cried. Kosoi approached, leaned over her, grabbed her by the hair, lifted her head, and slammed it against the floor. Once, twice. Anna felt the taste of blood in her mouth and saw circles floating before her eyes. Then everything became blurry. Grib stood nearby, watching, laughing, telling them not to kill her, or there would be trouble later. Kosoy let Anna go, saying that was enough, that she should now think about who she was getting involved with. The trio left the kiosk, taking several bottles of vodka and cartons of cigarettes. They left the door wide open. Anna lay on the floor of the kiosk, unable to get up. Her whole body ached, her head was spinning, and it wasn't easy to breathe. She felt warm moisture between her legs and realized it was blood. Panic seized her. The baby. What about the baby? She tried to get up but couldn't. She just cried, lying on the cold floor, praying that someone would come and help her. About half an hour later, in complete darkness, a neighbor, Maria Vasilyevna, was passing by the kiosk on her way back from visiting relatives. She saw that the kiosk door was open and the light was on, but no one was visible. She went inside and saw Anna lying on the floor, covered in blood and unconscious. Maria Vasilyevna screamed and ran to call for help. Several other women and men came running. They carefully lifted Anna and carried her to the home of the paramedic, Klavdia Semenovna. Klavdia examined her and found multiple bruises, hematomas, a broken lip, and abrasions. But the worst thing was the bleeding. Klavdia gave Anna a hemostatic agent and treated her wounds, but she understood that she needed a real hospital, doctors, and an examination. Someone ran to the village council chairman, who had the only telephone in the village. The chairman called the district center and called an ambulance. The ambulance arrived only an hour later. The road was broken, and in the darkness and rain, they drove slowly. Anna was taken to the district hospital. Meanwhile, someone ran to warn Anna's husband, Ivan Boyko. Ivan was working in the forest that day, cutting down trees. When he was told that his wife was in the hospital and had been beaten, he turned pale, dropped his tools, and ran home. He changed his clothes, took some money, caught a ride, and went to the district center. He arrived at the hospital around 9 in the evening. Anna was lying in her room, pale, with bruises on her face, crying. Ivan approached her, hugged her, and asked what had happened. Anna told him about the 3 men, about the beating, about how they beat her and kicked her, how she thought she was going to die and lose her child. The doctor, a young woman, came out of the ward and told Ivan that the baby was alive, had a heartbeat, but was in serious condition, at risk of miscarriage and needed rest and observation. Anna was lucky. The blows were mainly to her side and back. Her stomach was not severely affected, but a little more, and it could have been much worse. Ivan listened and nodded, but his face showed no emotion. He looked at his wife, at her bruises, at her tears, and something cold and heavy settled inside him. The doctor said that Anna needed to stay in the hospital for a few days under observation. Ivan nodded, kissed his wife on the forehead, and said everything would be fine. He would take care of it. Then he left the hospital, got into the car that had brought him there, and asked to be taken back to the village. On the way, he was silent, looking out the window at the darkness and the rain. The driver tried to strike up a conversation, asking how his wife was and what the doctors had said. Ivan answered in monosyllables and did not engage in conversation. When they arrived at the village, it was already past midnight. Ivan got out at his house, thanked the driver, and went inside. The house was empty and cold. He lit a kerosene lamp, sat down at the table, and sat motionless for several minutes. Then he got up and went to the shed. He took a strong nylon rope, about 20 meters long, from under some old boards. He checked its strength. It would hold. He put the rope in an old canvas bag. He returned to the house, put on a dark jacket and canvas boots, and took a lantern. He left the house and headed toward where Kosoy, Grib, and Pasha lived. Ivan Boyko was not a man who talked much or showed his emotions. 28 years old, of average height, strong build, with a hard, weather-beaten face and light, almost transparent eyes. He was born in Luniha, grew up here, and in 1985 was drafted into the army, serving in the airborne troops in Tula. For 2 years, he jumped out of planes, learned hand-to-hand combat, shot guns, and marched. He returned to the village in 1987 and got a job at the forestry enterprise as a lumberjack. It was hard work, but stable, and although the pay was low, it was regular. In 1991, he met Anna at a village festival, and 6 months later, they got married. They lived a quiet, modest life. Ivan was a man of few words, but he was caring. He repaired the house, worked in the garden, and brought home a salary. Anna was happy with him. When she found out she was pregnant, Ivan smiled for the first time in a long time, broadly and sincerely. He said it would be a son, that he would teach him to hunt, fish, and be strong. But now, walking through the dark village with a bag and a rope, Ivan wasn't thinking about the future. He was thinking about only one thing: the 3 men who had beaten his wife, his pregnant wife, and nearly killed his child. And he knew what he had to do. He didn't plan. He didn't think about the consequences. He just walked because he couldn't walk. Something inside him broke when he saw Anna in the hospital ward. Something that kept him within the bounds of the law, society, and morality. That something disappeared, and all that remained was a cold, calm desire to punish. First, he went to Kosoy. Kosoy's house was on the edge of the village, a dilapidated hut with a crooked roof and no lights. Ivan approached, shone his flashlight into the window. Inside, Kosoy was lying on the floor, drunk and unconscious, surrounded by empty bottles. The door was not locked. Kosam had nothing to lock, nothing to steal. Ivan entered. Kosam did not move, snoring, reeking of alcohol and urine. Ivan took a rope out of his bag, measured out a piece, tied Kosam's hands behind his back, then his legs. Kosoy stirred, muttered something, but did not wake up. Ivan tightened the knot around his neck, not too tight, not too loose, just enough to hold him. Then he took Kosoy under his arms and dragged him to the door. Kosoy was tall but thin and didn't weigh much. Ivan easily dragged him to his house, to the barn, and threw him on the floor. Kosoy groaned and began to come to, but Ivan punched him in the head. Not hard, but enough to knock him out again. Then Ivan went to look for Grib. Grib lived with his mother in a house in the middle of the village. Ivan approached cautiously, looked in the window. Grib's mother was sleeping in one room, Grib in another. Ivan quietly opened the door and went in. Grib's room smelled the same, alcohol and dirt. Grib was lying on the bed, drunk, asleep. Ivan repeated the procedure. He tied his hands and feet and tightened the rope around his neck. Grib woke up, started screaming and struggling, but Ivan covered his mouth with his hand, pressed him against the bed, and whispered in his ear to be quiet. Otherwise, he would kill him right there. Grib fell silent and began to tremble. Ivan dragged him out of the house, carried him to the shed, and threw him next to Kosi. The last one was Pasha Koratish. He lived with his brother, whose house was on the other side of the village. Ivan went there without fear or hesitation. He just went and did his job. Pasha was home alone. His brother had gone away to work. The door was locked, but Ivan knew that the window in the backyard didn't close. He climbed through the window and found himself in the kitchen. He went into the room. Pasha was sleeping on the sofa, a half-full bottle of vodka standing next to him. Pasha was stronger than the others, and Ivan knew it might be harder with him. He approached quietly, took out a rope, quickly threw a noose around Pasha's neck, and tightened it. Pasha woke up, began to choke, grabbed the rope, and tried to break free. Ivan held it tight, not letting him breathe fully, but not choking him to death. just to the point of semi-consciousness. Pasha weakened and stopped resisting. Ivan tied his hands and feet and wrapped the rope around his body so he couldn't escape. Then he pulled him out the window and dragged him to the shed. When all three were in the barn, Ivan closed the door and lit a lamp. The three lay on the floor, tied up, two unconscious, Pasha barely breathing, looking at Ivan with horror. Ivan looked at them silently for several minutes. Then he said quietly, almost in a whisper, that they had beaten his wife, that they could have killed his child, that they had terrorized the village for years, beating, robbing, raping, and that no one had stopped them because everyone was afraid, because there was no law. After all, the police didn't come because you could do anything with impunity. Ivan said that he would stop them, that he would do what the authorities should have done, but did not. That he was not a judge or an executioner, but a husband and future father, and that he would not allow people like them to continue living in this village and poisoning the lives of others. He said this calmly, without emotion, without shouting. He stated the facts. Then Ivan turned off the lamp, left the barn, and locked the door. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. The rain had stopped, the sky had cleared, and the stars had appeared. Ivan returned to the house, sat down on the porch, and lit a cigarette. He sat there until dawn, smoking one cigarette after another, staring into the darkness. When dawn broke, around 5 in the morning, Ivan got up and returned to the barn. Kosoy and Grib had already come to their senses and were trying to untie themselves, shouting and threatening. Pasha was silent, staring at Ivan. Ivan led each of them out of the barn in turn. They walked bound, with ropes around their necks, Ivan leading them, holding the ends of the ropes. He led them to an oak grove on the outskirts of the village. There stood an old, giant oak tree, centuries old, with a thick trunk and powerful branches. Ivan chose 3 branches, about 4 meters above the ground, strong enough to support a person's weight. He made each of them stand under their branch. Kosoy shouted that Ivan was crazy, that he would go to jail, that they would find him and put him in prison, that he was a murderer. Grib cried, begged, said he would never do it again, that he would leave the village, that they would forgive him. Pasha was silent, just watching. Ivan threw the ropes over the branches and tied professional knots. He had learned how to do this in the army, in mountaineering classes. He checked to make sure the knots wouldn't come undone. Then he tightened the nooses around their necks one by one. Tight, but not too tight, so as not to strangle them right away. He said a last word to each of them. To Kosom, that he got what he deserved for years of violence and evil. To Grib, that tears and pleas would not help, that his wife had also cried and begged, but they had not stopped. To Pasha, that he especially deserved death for what he had done before, for rape, for beatings, for beating a pregnant woman. Then Ivan pulled on the ropes. One tug, Kosoy flew up, his feet left the ground, the rope tightened, he began to choke and jerk. Second tug, Grib. Third, Pasha. Ivan tied the ends of the ropes around the trunk of an oak tree and secured them. The 3 hung there, twitching, trying to breathe, wheezing. Ivan stood and watched. This went on for several minutes, long, agonizing minutes. Gradually, the movement slowed, and the wheezing subsided. The bodies went limp and hung motionless. Ivan waited another 5 minutes to make sure they were all dead. Then he untied the ropes from the trunk and let them go. The bodies hung from the branches, swaying in the morning breeze. Ivan gathered the rope, the bag, and the lantern. He looked around. There was no one around, only the forest, and the birds began to sing, greeting the dawn. Ivan returned home. He washed, changed into clean clothes, put the dirty clothes and rope in the stove, and burned them. Then he lay down on the bed and closed his eyes. He fell asleep almost immediately, a deep, peaceful sleep. Shepherd Vasily Kuzmich went to work at 6 in the morning on 27 September. He had to drive the collective farm cattle, several cows belonging to different village owners, to a distant pasture. The path led through an oak grove. As Vasily approached the grove, the cow in front suddenly stopped, mooed anxiously, and backed away. Vasily was surprised and went forward to see what had happened. And he saw. 3 men were hanging from an oak tree, ropes around their necks, their bodies motionless, their faces blue, their eyes open, their tongues hanging out. The wind swayed their bodies, and they slowly rotated on the ropes. Vasily screamed, fell to his knees, and crossed himself. The cow was frightened by the scream and ran back to the village. Vasily sat on the ground, staring at the dead men, unable to move. Then he gathered his strength, stood up, and ran to the village, shouting that there were corpses there, that someone had been hanged. His cry woke up the village. People ran out of their houses asking what had happened. Vasily pointed toward the grove and shouted about the hanged men. Several men ran there to look. When they saw, they returned pale and confirmed that 3 men had been hanged and were all dead. Someone ran to the village council chairman. The chairman, a man named Krasnov, in his 50s, a former military man, came running and inspected the site. He realized that this was a serious crime and that the police and the prosecutor's office needed to be called. He ran home and called the district police department. The police arrived an hour and a half later, a task force, an investigator, and forensic experts. They cordoned off the area and began their investigation. They removed the bodies, laid them on the ground, and examined them. There were marks of strangulation on their necks, ropes cut into their skin, and the nooses had been tied professionally. There were marks from ropes on their hands and feet. They had been tied up. This was not a suicide. It was murder. The investigator, a man named Samoylov, began questioning the residents. Who had seen anything suspicious? Who had heard screams or noise? No one had seen or heard anything. The night was quiet. The rain had stopped, and everyone was asleep. The bodies were quickly identified: Kosoy, Grib, and Pasha, local alcoholics, all with criminal records. The investigator asked if they had any enemies, anyone who might want to kill them. There were many answers. Half the village might have wanted them dead. They had terrorized people for years. But who exactly decided to kill them? Then one of the women remembered the beating of Anna Boyko. She told the investigator that last night these 3 had beaten up a pregnant saleswoman, that she had been taken to the hospital, and that her husband, Ivan Boyko, was furious when he found out. The investigator ordered that Ivan Boyko be found and brought in for questioning. The police went to the Boyko house and knocked on the door. Ivan opened it, calm, in clean clothes, having just woken up. They asked him to come with them for a chat. Ivan got dressed and went with them without resistance. The interrogation took place in the village council's chairman's office. Investigator Samoylov sat at the table, Ivan opposite him. Samoylov asked where Ivan had been the previous night. Ivan replied that he had been at home, asleep. Were there any witnesses? No. His wife was in the hospital. He was alone. Did Ivan know what had happened to Kozy, Grib, and Pasha? Yes. He had been told that they had been found, hanged. What did Ivan think about that? Ivan shrugged and said that they probably got what they deserved. Samoylov asked directly whether Ivan had killed the 3 men. Ivan looked him in the eye and was silent for a few seconds. Then he nodded. He said yes, he had killed them. Samoylov did not expect such a quick confession. He asked why. Ivan told him everything, about the beating of his wife, about how he saw her in the hospital, about how he realized that these 3 would never be punished, that the police would do nothing, that they would continue to terrorize the village, that they were dangerous, that they could have killed his child. Samoylov asked if Ivan was remorseful. Ivan shook his head. He said he did what he had to do, that he protected his family, that those three would never hurt anyone else. He said he was ready to take responsibility, but he didn't regret it. Ivan was arrested right there. They handcuffed him, put him in a police car, and took him to the district center. The case was transferred to the prosecutor's office. The news of Ivan's arrest spread through the village instantly. The reaction was mixed. Some were horrified. How could anyone kill 3 people? Hang them! It was monstrous. But most people, especially those who had suffered at the hands of the trio, said quietly that Ivan had done the right thing, that someone had to stop them, that it was a pity, of course, that he now faced prison, but that the village had become safer. Anna, upon learning of her husband's arrest, became hysterical. The doctors barely managed to calm her down and gave her a sedative. She cried and screamed that it was her fault, that if she hadn't worked at the kiosk and refused them, nothing would have happened. Her relatives tried to comfort her, saying that it wasn't her fault, that Ivan had made the decision himself, that he was an adult. A criminal case was opened under Article 105, the intentional murder of 2 or more persons. This is a grave crime, with the maximum punishment being the death penalty, but in 1994, a moratorium on the death penalty was already in effect. Hence, the maximum sentence was life imprisonment or a long prison term. The investigation was a formality. Ivan confessed and gave a detailed account of how and why he killed the 3 people. Forensic experts found evidence, traces of rope, Ivan's shoe prints near the oak tree, and witnesses confirmed that the 3 had beaten Anna the day before. The motive was clear: revenge for his wife. Ivan's defense attorney, a state-appointed lawyer named Tkachev, tried to build a defense based on emotional distress, arguing that Ivan had acted in a state of intense emotional turmoil caused by the victim's unlawful actions. But the investigation rejected this argument. Several hours had passed between the beating of his wife and the murder, and Ivan had acted deliberately and systematically. It was not a spontaneous act. The case went to trial in March 1995. The trial was held in the district center, in the district court building. Residents of Lunik came to the prosecution to support Ivan. Some brought letters in his defense, petitions with signatures, asking the court to take into account the circumstances, to consider that the victims were dangerous repeat offenders, and that Ivan was defending his family. The prosecutor demanded the maximum sentence, 15 years in prison. He said that vigilante justice was unacceptable, that Ivan had taken on the roles of judge and executioner, and that this undermined the foundations of the rule of law. The defense requested the minimum sentence, citing mitigating circumstances. Ivan was an exemplary citizen, had no previous convictions, was defending his family, and the victims were aggressors who had repeatedly broken the law. Ivan himself was calm in court, almost indifferent. He confirmed all the circumstances of the case and did not attempt to justify himself. When the judge asked what he wanted to say in his defense, Ivan stood up and spoke briefly that he had done what he thought was right, that his wife and child were alive because he had stopped these people, and that he had no regrets. The court withdrew for deliberation. It returned an hour later. The sentence was 10 years imprisonment in a strict regime penal colony. Mitigating circumstances were taken into account, but the murder of 3 people is a serious crime, and the punishment must be commensurate. Ivan accepted the sentence without emotion. He was taken to a colony in the Vladimir region. Anna gave birth to a son 2 months after the trial, in May 1995. She named him Ivan, after his father. She wrote letters to her husband, sent photos of her son, and waited. Ivan served 8 years and was released on parole in 2003 for good behavior. He returned to the village of Lunyha, where his wife and 8-year-old son met him. The village had changed over the years. It had become even smaller, even poorer, but calmer. The Troika no longer terrorized anyone. The shop had closed in 1996. There was no point in keeping it open, as there were almost no customers left. Anna worked in the district center as a cleaner in a hospital. Ivan got a job again at the forestry enterprise as a logger. They lived quietly. Their son grew up, studied, and then left for the city. Ivan and Anna stayed in the village, grew old, but were together. That's all, friends. If you found this interesting, give it a thumbs up and be sure to write your opinion in the comments. See you soon. Bye for now. The most horrific crimes in human history were committed not in the name of the devil, but in the name of God. The Inquisition burned people at the stake in the name of saving souls. The Crusades killed thousands in the name of faith. Sects starved and tortured their followers in the name of purification from sin. Because faith is power, absolute power over the mind, over the will, over a person's life. And when this power is wielded not by a saint, but by a predator, not by a shepherd, but by a manipulator, he can do monstrous things under the guise of sacred words. This is the story of how one man in a cassock turned a remote village into a personal hell for 10 women. How he kept them chained in a basement for 2 years, raping, beating, and starving them, convincing them that he was atoning for their sins. How he hid behind God to do evil. And how no one noticed, because it was the 1990s in Russia, a time when the state was not functioning, and people clung to faith as their last hope. By the mid-1990s, the village of Ivanovka in the Kalinin district of the Tver region had become a ghost town. Of the 200 houses, only about 50 remained inhabited. The Lenin Collective Farm, which once fed the entire district, collapsed in 1992 after privatization, which brought nothing but stolen property and poverty. Tractors stood rusting at the edge of the field. The cowshed was empty, the school was closed, and the medical center was open once a week when the paramedic came from the district center. Most older adults lived on their gardens and pensions, which were delayed by 6 months. The young people left, some to Tver, some to Moscow, and some to who knows where. Only those who had nowhere to go or nothing to go on remained. Families of alcoholics, unemployed people, women with children without husbands, and disabled people. The village was dying slowly, quietly, without the authorities' attention, without hope. In places like this, people cling to any straw, any promise of a better life, anyone who says that everything will work out. So, when, in March 1995, a man in a black cassock arrived in Ivanovka, introduced himself as Father John, and said that he had been sent to revive spirituality in places forgotten by God, he was welcomed with hope. He was about 45 years old, tall and stocky, with long dark hair and a thick beard. He spoke beautifully, with a deep, confident voice, quoted scripture by heart, and crossed himself broadly in the manner of the church. He always wore a black cassock, even in the heat, with a large copper cross on his chest. He arrived in an old UAZ, which contained icons, candles, and church books. He said that he had previously served in a monastery near Pskov. However, the Lord had called him to go to the people, to places where people had strayed from the faith, where souls were perishing in drunkenness and despondency. He had received the abbot's blessing, he said, and was now traveling through the villages, restoring spiritual life. The older adults believed him. There had been no church in the village since the 1930s, when the Bolsheviks destroyed it. They had not seen a priest for decades. And here he was, Father John, who had come himself, performing prayers, hearing confessions, and administering communion free of charge. The grandmothers wept with joy that they had lived to see such times. Father John settled in the old village club building, which had been abandoned since the 1980s. The building was brick, 2-story, with a large hall on the first floor and several rooms on the second. The basement was deep. It used to store props for amateur performances, scenery, and costumes. He repaired the building himself, whitewashed the walls, and put up icons and crosses. He turned the first floor into a chapel where believers gathered on Sundays. The second floor was his living quarters. He locked the basement and said it was a storage room for church property. At first, he behaved perfectly. He helped the elderly with their chores, repaired fences, chopped wood, and brought groceries from the regional center to those who could not get out on their own. He did not charge for his services, saying he served God, not mammon. He held evening talks on faith, the lives of saints, sin, and repentance. He was a good speaker, and people listened spellbound. Women listened especially attentively. They were the majority in the village, and most of them were unhappy. Their husbands drank, beat them, and abandoned them. Their children grew up in poverty, with no future. Father John promised salvation, promised that faith would help, that God would not leave them, that they only needed to endure, pray, and hope. And he also spoke about sin. He spoke a lot about sin. He said that the whole world was mired in sin, that television, music, and cities were all satanic, that salvation was only possible by renouncing worldly things and fleeing from temptation. He said that women were especially sinful because it was through them that the first sin came into the world, through Eve. He said that women must atone for their sins through humility, obedience, and suffering. At first, it sounded like a typical church sermon, but gradually, the tone became harsher. He began to say that the girls in the village dressed sinfully, listened to devilish music, and engaged in promiscuous relationships with boys, and that they needed to be saved before it was too late. In the summer of 1995, Father John announced that he was opening a shelter in his community for girls who wanted to change their lives, turn away from sin, and learn honest work and a pure life. He loudly named it Shelter for Lost Souls. He promised free accommodation, food, training in needlework, and the opportunity to find work in the city through church connections. There were many such girls in the village and its surroundings. They were adults, 18 to 20 years old, from families where the fathers had alcoholism, the mothers were tormented, or also drank, where there was no money, no work, and no prospects. They had finished school, but there was no money for further education, no work in the village, and it was scary and expensive to go to the city. They sat at home, helped with the housework, and waited for who knows what. Father John would visit these families, talk to the parents, and say that the girl could be taken in, taught sewing, embroidery, and church singing, and then she would find her place in life, maybe working at a church somewhere or marrying a good religious man. The parents agreed, especially if they had several children, and it was not easy to feed an extra mouth. The first to arrive were two girls, Nastya and Marina, both 18, from neighboring villages. They lived with Father John on the second floor, in a standard room, sleeping on mattresses on the floor. The regime was strict. Wake up at 6 in the morning, prayer, breakfast, housework, lunch, needlework, evening service, dinner, sleep at 10 in the evening. There was no TV, no radio, only church books. Nastya and Marina lasted a month before saying they wanted to leave. Father John did not object. He let them go quietly and even gave them money for the road. The girls returned home and said that life there was boring, with a lot of praying and working, and poor food. But it wasn't scary. They weren't beaten or mistreated. It just wasn't for them, so they decided to try their luck in the city. This was important. It created the impression that it was possible to leave the shelter, that no one was holding anyone there. This reassured those who later sent their daughters there. They thought that if anything happened, the girl could always come back. But something changed after Nastya and Marina left. Father John became more careful in his selection. Now he was looking not just for girls from low-income families, but for particularly vulnerable girls. Orphans living with distant relatives. Girls from families where the parents didn't care. Girls who had no one who would miss them. In the fall of 1995, Olya, 19 years old, came to him. She lived with her alcoholic mother and stepfather, who molested her. Father John took her in, promising protection, and a new life. Olya was grateful, ready for anything, so that she didn't have to go home. A month later, Svetlana, 20 years old, came. She had no parents and had been living with her grandmother, who had died, leaving the girl with nowhere to go. Then Lena, 18, ran away from home, where her father was a tyrant. By winter, there were 5 girls in the shelter. They lived on the second floor, did housework, prayed, and learned needlework. Father John said that they must humble their flesh with work and prayer, that the outside world was sinful and dangerous, and that here they were under God's protection. Gradually, the regime became stricter, meals became less frequent and portions smaller. He explained that fasting cleanses the soul. There was more work to do. He forced the girls to work in a large vegetable garden, sow for sale, and clean the building from top to bottom every day. He punished the slightest violation with hours of kneeling with raised hands, hundreds of bows, and food deprivation. When one of the girls, Lena, tried to leave, Father John locked her in the basement for 3 days. He told the others that she had sinned in her thoughts, and that she must atone for it through prayer in solitude. When Lena was released, she was pale and trembling, but she remained silent. She did not try to leave again. By the spring of 1996, there were already 8 girls in the shelter. Father John established a new rule that they had to give him their passports for safekeeping, supposedly for security reasons, so that they would not be lost. The girls gave them to him, not seeing the catch. Without a passport, it was more difficult to leave. You couldn't find a place to stay, and the police could detain you. In the summer of 1996, 2 more girls, Katya and Olesya, came to the shelter. Katya was from Tver. She had run away from her partner, who beat her, and ended up in the village by accident. She heard about Father John and decided to ask for help. Olesya was a local from a neighboring town. She came from a large, low-income family, and her parents gave her away to ease the family's budget. Now there were 10 of them. 10 girls between the ages of 18 and 22, living in Father John's house, isolated from the world, subject to his will. By the fall of 1996, Father John had finally transformed from a strict mentor into a tyrant. He no longer hid his cruelty or pretended to be a benefactor. The girls became his property, which he disposed of at his discretion. The basement became the center of his system of punishment. The basement was large, about 50 square meters, divided into several rooms by partitions. The ceiling was low, 2 meters high, and the walls were brick, cold, and damp. There were no windows, and ventilation was poor. There was electricity, but Father John only turned on the lights when he went down there himself. The rest of the time, it was dark. He equipped the basement with cells. In one room, he installed metal rings embedded in the walls and floor, to which he attached chains. The chains were thick, rusty, with handcuffs or shackles. In another room, he locked them up, leaving them without light or food for a day or more. The girls were sent to the basement for any disobedience. She refused to work in the basement for 3 days. She tried to leave for a week in the basement. I cried and complained for a day in the basement, without food. I tried to resist when he came to them at night on the second floor for what he called spiritual intimacy. That is, a month of violence in the basement in chains. The violence began about a year after the first girls came to the shelter. Father John explained it theologically. He said that women must serve men, who are representatives of God on earth, that by serving him, they serve the Lord, that their bodies do not belong to them, but to the church, and he is the head of that church. That refusal is a sin that will be punished. Olya was the first. He came to her at night when the others were asleep, took her to his room, and raped her. Then he said that if she told anyone, he would kill her and bury her in the forest, and no one would find her. Olya remained silent, afraid. Then there were others, one after another, regularly. The girls tried to resist at first. But after he beat one of them, Sveta, until her ribs were broken and kept her in the basement for 2 weeks on bread and water, the resistance stopped. They obeyed because they saw no way out. By the winter of 1996, the regime had become completely brutal. They were fed once a day, in the evening, with porridge or vegetable soup, almost without meat. They were given little water and had to ask for it. The building had heating, but the second floor was poorly heated, so the girls slept fully clothed, covering themselves with whatever they could find. They worked from morning till night. There was a large vegetable garden that had to be tended, although there was less work in winter. But he made them sew a lot. He brought fabric and thread and made them sew tablecloths, towels, and shirts, which he then sold at the market in the district center. He said that this was their contribution to the community, that the money was going to a good cause. All contact with the outside world was cut off. There was no telephone in the building, and in 1997, almost no one in the villages had mobile phones. Writing letters was forbidden. Leaving the premises was prohibited. The windows on the second floor were closed with shutters from the inside, so that the girls would not look out onto the street and dream of escape. Father Ioan constantly instilled in them that the outside world had disappeared, that war had begun there, that cities had been destroyed, that they could only survive here, under his protection. If they left, they would be captured by bandits, raped, and killed. The police would not protect them because the police were corrupt and sinful. Their relatives had abandoned them and considered them dead. Some believed him, some did not believe him, but were afraid to test him. The basement was scarier than the unknown outside. The girls spent weeks in the basement, one after another. Someone was always being punished. Someone was kept there as an example to the others. Chained to the wall by their wrists or ankles, sitting on the cold concrete floor, in the dark, in the damp, listening to the rats rustling in the corners. They were fed once every 2 days. Father John would bring them a bowl of bread and water, throw it down, and leave. The toilet was a bucket in the corner. Some of them went crazy. Olya started talking to voices she heard in the dark. Sveta scratched the walls with her fingernails until they bled, trying to make a hole. Lena just sat motionless for days, not reacting to anything. Father John said that demons were coming out of them, that it was normal, that suffering was cleansing, and that they should thank him for this opportunity to atone for their sins. By the spring of 1997, all 10 girls had turned into shadows, emaciated, sick, with falling hair, rotten teeth, and skin diseases, psychologically broken, having lost their will, hope, and personality. They obeyed automatically, without thinking, like robots. They worked, prayed, endured abuse, returned to the basement, went out, and worked again. The village paid little attention. Father John continued to hold prayer services on Sundays, which were attended by the elderly. They saw him as polite, pious, and talking about God. The girls were not seen. They did not leave the building. If anyone asked where they were, Father John replied that they were working, praying, leading a reclusive life like ancient ascetics. This sounded plausible to believers. Some of the girls' relatives tried to visit from time to time. Father John did not let them in, saying that the girls were in prayerful obedience, that they should not be disturbed, that visits were forbidden during the probationary period. He promised that later, after a year, when they had completed their purification, it would be possible to see them. Most relatives accepted this, especially if they were drunkards or indifferent. Only one mother, Olesia's mother, Vera Nikolaevna, did not calm down. She tried to see her daughter several times, but Father John refused. She went to the village council and complained that her daughter was being held against her will. The chairman of the village council, an older man and a drinker, waved her off, saying that she was an adult and had chosen to live with the priest, and that was her right. Vera Nikolaevna went to the district center, to the police. They did not help either, saying that without a statement from the girl herself, there was no basis for intervention. But Vera Nikolaevna did not give up. She wrote a letter to the diocese in Tver, described the situation, and asked them to verify whether Father Ioan was indeed a priest and whether his parish was legitimate. The reply came a month later. No, Father Ioan was serving in the Kalinin district in the diocese. Moreover, they conducted a search based on the description and found a similar person in the database. It was Ivan Petrovich Morozov, 50 years old, previously convicted of fraud, who had served 5 years in prison in the early 90s and disappeared after his release. He had never been a priest and had no connection to the church. Vera Nikolaevna brought this letter to the police. This time, they listened to her. The local police officer, Sergei Viktorovich, a good, conscientious man, decided to check it out. On 14th June 1997, Sergei Viktorovich arrived in Ivanovka, drove up to Father John's house, and knocked on the door. Father John opened the door, calm and friendly, and asked how he could help. Sergei Viktorovich said he had received a complaint from the mother of one of the girls living in the shelter, who wanted to make sure her daughter was okay, and asked if he could see the girl. Father John did not refuse. He called Olesya to the first floor. Olesya came out, thin, pale, in an old dress with a scarf on her head. The police officer asked her how she was doing, whether she wanted to go home, and whether everything was okay. Olesya replied quietly, monotonously, "Everything is fine. I don't want to go home. It's good here. I serve God." Sergei Viktorovich did not believe her. Something in her eyes, in her voice, was wrong. He asked to inspect the building, saying it was a routine security check. Father John could not refuse without arousing suspicion, so he agreed, but requested that the girls not be disturbed as they were praying. They inspected the first floor and found nothing unusual: a chapel, icons, and benches. The second floor consisted of living quarters, with Father John's room separate from the girls' large room, which had mattresses on the floor. It was inferior, but not criminal. Sergei Viktorovich asked, "What about the basement?" Father John replied, "It's a storage room, church property, nothing interesting." The district police officer insisted, "Show us anyway." They went down to the basement. Father John unlocked the door and turned on the light. Sergei Viktorovich entered and looked around. There were several rooms, one of which was indeed a storage room with boxes, bags, and tools. The other was empty, except for rings in the wall and chains on the floor. The local police officer asked, "What are these for?" Father John replied calmly, "Something used to be stored here. I don't know, it's left over from Soviet times." But Sergei Viktorovich was no fool. He looked closely at the chains. They weren't completely rusty. Some parts were shiny, as if they had been used recently. He picked up one chain and saw stains on the handcuffs that looked like blood. He looked at the scratches on the concrete floor, as if someone had tried to scratch something out. He asked directly, "Did you keep people here?" Father John turned pale but held his ground. "No, what are you talking about? It's for storage. Maybe we kept animals here once." Sergei Viktorovich left the basement, went up to the second floor, and entered the girls' room without permission. All 10 of them were sitting there on the floor, staring at the floor without looking up. The police officer said, "Girls, if you are being held against your will, tell me, and I will help you." Silence. He repeated louder, "Can you hear me? If you need help, speak up." One of the girls, Katya, the youngest, 18 years old, looked up, looked at the police officer, opened her mouth, but said nothing. Father John stood in the doorway, looking at her with a heavy gaze. Katya lowered her eyes again. Sergei Viktorovich realized that they were afraid to speak in front of him. He left and said to Father John, "I'll be back tomorrow with the prosecutor. There will be an inspection. Get ready." Father John nodded calmly, but inside he was panicking. He understood that if the prosecutor came, they would start questioning the girls separately, and they might break down. Something had to be done. At night, he went down to the girls' room, woke them up, and said, "The police are coming tomorrow, and they will ask questions. If anyone says anything against me, I will kill you all, burn down the building, and no one will survive. Is that clear?" The girls nodded, frightened, but one of them, Olesia, the one whose mother had written the complaints, decided to take a risk. She understood that this might be her last chance. At night, when Father John was asleep, she crept up to the door, which he usually locked, but this time left ajar, slipped out, ran down the stairs, and ran out of the building. She ran through the village, night, dark, cold, barefoot, in just a shirt. She ran to the highway, 2 kilometers from the town, ran out onto the road, and started waving her arms. Several cars passed by, but didn't stop. Finally, a long-distance truck stopped, driven by a man in his 40s. He saw her shaking, dirty and frightened, and asked, "What happened?" Olesia cried out, "Help! They're holding us there. 10 people in the basement, raping us, starving us. Save us." The truck driver didn't believe her at first, thinking that the girl was out of her mind, maybe a drug addict, perhaps mentally ill. But just in case, he put her in the cab and took her to the regional center, straight to the police station. The officer on duty, Captain Volkov, listened to Olesia, looked at her condition, exhausted, dirty, with signs of beatings on her arms and legs, abrasions, bruises. He called an ambulance and sent her to the hospital for examination. The doctors confirmed that the girl had been in conditions close to torture for a long time, showing signs of prolonged starvation, dehydration, multiple injuries, and traces of violence. Captain Volkov raised the alarm throughout the entire department. At 5 o'clock in the morning on 15th of June, a group of 10 police officers with automatic weapons drove to Ivanovka. They surrounded Father John's house, broke down the door, and stormed inside. Father John was on the first floor, wearing a cassock, calm, as if he had been waiting. He said, "Why such measures? I haven't broken any laws. This is all a misunderstanding." The police went up to the second floor and found 9 girls in a room, locked from the outside. They went down to the basement, broke the locks, and found cameras, chains, shackles, traces of blood on the walls, a bucket of excrement, scratches on the floor, and inscriptions scratched with fingernails. "Help! Save us! We are here." The girls were brought outside, wrapped in blankets, and put into cars. They were silent, crying, shaking. One, Sveta, whispered repeatedly. He said that God would take us away if we left. He said that the world was ending. Father John was arrested without resistance. He was handcuffed and put in a car. He smiled all the way to the district center, telling the police, "You don't understand. I was saving them. I was doing a good deed. They were sinners. I was cleansing their souls. I was serving God." The investigation took 4 months. All 10 girls were questioned separately by psychologists. At first, they were afraid to speak, but gradually, when they realized that Father John could no longer harm them, they began to talk. It turned out he had kept them at the shelter for between 6 months and 2 years. The last 2, Katya and Olesia, had been there for 9 months. The first ones, Olya, Sveta, and Lena, were there for almost 2 years. During this time, all of them were raped repeatedly, regularly, under threat of murder. All of them were beaten, some repeatedly, to the point of fractures and concussions. All of them were locked in the basement in chains, some for days, some for weeks. All were starved, deprived of food and water for disobedience, sometimes for several days. All were forced to work 12 to 14 hours a day without pay or days off. All were deprived of passports, contact with the outside world, and the opportunity to leave. Medical examinations showed that all of them suffered from chronic exhaustion, anemia, vitamin deficiency, skin diseases, dental problems, gynecological trauma from violence, psychological disorders, post-traumatic stress, depression, and, in some cases, signs of dissociation and psychosis. A psychiatric examination of Ivan Petrovich Morozov, the real name of Father Ioan, showed that he was sane and aware of his actions, but had pronounced narcissistic and sadistic personality traits, a messianic complex, that is, a belief in his own chosen status and right to rule over others. Psychiatrists described him as a classic manipulator and sectarian who used religious rhetoric to justify violence and control. They noted that he felt no remorse, considered himself right, and blamed his victims. The investigation established that Morozov had indeed been previously convicted in 1987 for fraud, deceiving older adults under the guise of a healer, served 5 years, and was released in 1992. After his release, he led a nomadic lifestyle for several years, studied religious literature, visited monasteries as a pilgrim, and observed how church life was organized. Then he decided to create his own sect under the guise of an Orthodox community, choosing a remote village where no one would check his documents and credentials. The trial took place in October 1997 in Tver. Morozov was charged with unlawful deprivation of liberty, rape, torture, fraud, and creating a religious organization that infringed on the personality and rights of citizens. The prosecutor demanded a sentence of 15 years imprisonment in a strict regime colony. The defense attorney tried to prove that the girls were in the community voluntarily, that Morozov did not use physical violence, and that everything was by mutual consent within the framework of religious practices. But the victims' testimonies, medical examinations, and photographs of the basement with chains refuted this version. The court found Morozov guilty on all counts and sentenced him to 14 years in a strict regime colony. Morozov listened to the verdict standing, without emotion, only smiling when the judge read the final word. Then he said, "I am right before God. You are all sinners. When Judgment Day comes, you will answer for your sins, and I will be justified." He was transferred to a colony in Mordovia. He served 9 years there until 2006, when he died of lung cancer. He refused to admit his guilt until the end. After their release, all 10 girls underwent lengthy rehabilitation at a specialized center for victims of violence in Moscow. They were treated for physical illnesses and psychological trauma, and helped to adapt to everyday life. The recovery took years. Some were able to return to a relatively everyday life, while others were left with deep psychological scars. Olya, the first victim, spent 2 years in a psychiatric hospital after her release and was diagnosed with schizophrenia caused by prolonged stress. She now lives in a boarding school and receives disability benefits. Sveta recovered, returned to her parents' village, got married, had a child, and now works as a saleswoman. She says she tries not to remember those 2 years, but she still has nightmares. Lena moved to another city, changed her name, and started a new life from scratch. She does not keep in touch with the other victims. She wants to forget. Katya committed suicide in 2001, 4 years after her release. She couldn't cope with depression and guilt, even though she wasn't to blame. Olesya, the one who escaped and saved the others, became an activist, helping victims of cults and domestic violence. She speaks publicly, telling her story to warn others. She wrote a memoir, which was published in 2010. The other 5 girls live quietly, scattered across different cities, do not give interviews, and ask that their names and locations not be disclosed. The village of Ivanovka is now almost dead. After the scandal, many residents left, not wanting to live in a place with such a reputation. The former club, where it all happened, stands abandoned, its windows broken, its doors boarded up. Locals say that no one goes there because they are afraid. They say that screams can be heard at night, but these are most likely legends. The basement was filled with earth and bricked up, but the memory remains, and 10 women, whose lives were ruined, carry that memory with them every day. This is a story about how easy it is for a person to become a victim if they are lonely, poor, and defenseless, and about how easy it is for another person to turn into a monster if given power and impunity. A story set in a remote village in the Tver region in 1997, but it could have happened anywhere, anytime, if the conditions were right. In the early 1990s, in the provincial town of Borysoglebsk in the Voronezh region, an incident occurred that is still whispered about among the locals. 20-year-old surgeon Alexei took revenge on gangster Sergei Bury for raping his mother in the most brutal way possible. During a routine operation, he cut off his penis, then disappeared with his mother, leaving no trace. Burim, a man who had kept the entire city in fear, threw all his forces into the search but was unable to find them. This is a story about how a quiet, intelligent young man became a cold-blooded avenger, and about what happens when the law is silent and justice is taken into one's own hands. The year was 1993. Formally, the Soviet Union had not existed for 2 years. However, in Russia's provincial cities, the spirit of that time still held firm. A mixture of confusion, chaos, and fear of a new reality in which the old rules no longer worked, and the new ones had not yet been established. Borysoglebsk, a small town in the Voronezh region with a population of about 60,000, was a typical example of such a place. Factories stood idle, salaries had not been paid for months, and people survived as best they could, trading in markets, growing vegetables in their dachas, and taking out loans from acquaintances that they could not repay. In this vacuum of authority, organized criminal groups flourished. Local trade, markets, shops, and even private stalls were controlled by a group led by a man nicknamed Bury, Sergei, a 35-year-old former athlete and master of sports in boxing who served in the army in the 1980s. After his discharge, he worked as a security guard, then as a sports coach, and in the early 1990s, he gathered a group of similarly strong guys around him and began to build his criminal empire. Bury was short, 5'9", but broad-shouldered, muscular, with a square jaw, a crew cut, and cold gray eyes that showed no sympathy. He wore a black leather jacket, jeans, heavy boots, a gold chain around his neck, and rings on his fingers. His voice was low and calm, but when he spoke, everyone listened in silence. He was constantly followed by about 10 people. His crew, young guys aged 20 to 25, all athletic, all ready to carry out any order. He controlled practically the entire city. Every stall, every shop paid him tribute, from $50 to $300 a month, depending on the size of the business. Those who refused to pay received a warning, first with words, then with broken windows, then with beatings. Almost everyone paid. The police knew about Burr, but did nothing. Some of the officers had been bribed and received their share, while others were simply afraid, understanding that the system would not protect them if they went against the authority. This was the atmosphere in which Nina Alexeyevna, a 42-year-old Russian language and literature teacher at secondary school number 7, lived. She was a widow. Her husband had died 5 years ago of a heart attack. He had been an engineer at a local factory. He left her a 2-room apartment in a 5-story prefabricated building on the outskirts of the city, along with small savings, which quickly lost their value during the hyperinflation of the early 1990s. She lived on her teacher's salary, which was delayed by 3 to 4 months, and earned extra money by tutoring school children for exams at a nominal fee. Nina Alexeyevna was a calm, intelligent woman of medium height, slim, with dark hair that was beginning to turn gray, a kind face, and a soft voice. A respected teacher, she was loved by her students and appreciated by parents. She lived modestly and quietly, raising her son Alexei, her only child, who was the meaning of her life after her husband's death. Alexei, 20, was the complete opposite of the typical young man of that time. While his peers were trying to become gangsters or hustlers or simply survive on odd jobs, he was studying. He graduated from school with a gold medal, entered the Voronezh Medical Institute, and learned to become a surgeon. He was a quiet, serious, thin young man with dark hair and glasses, always holding books. He didn't drink, smoke, or get involved in crime, devoting all his time to his studies and helping his mother. After graduating from the institute in 1992, he was assigned to the Borisoglebsk District Hospital, worked as a surgeon, lived with his mother in the same apartment, gave her his entire salary, and was content with the minimum. Mother and son were very close. After his father's death, Alexei became not only Nina Alexeyevna's son, but also her support, friend, and confidant. They spent their evenings together, discussing books, medicine, and life. Nina was proud of her son, saw him as the continuation of the family's intellectual lineage, and hoped that he would be successful, perhaps move to a big city, and have a career. On the evening of 9th March 1993, around 8 p.m., someone rang the doorbell of Nina Alexeyevna's apartment. Alexei was not at home. He was on duty at the hospital, working the night shift, which he did twice a week. Nina opened the door without looking through the peephole, thinking it was a neighbor coming to borrow some salt or ask something. 3 men were standing on the doorstep. Sergei Bury was in the center, flanked by 2 of his men. Nina Alexeyevna did not recognize him, but she immediately sensed danger from their gaze, their posture, the way they entered the building without asking permission. Barry introduced himself and said he needed to talk to her about something important. Nina tried to close the door, saying that she had no one to talk to, that she was a teacher and knew nothing about the matters that might interest him. Barry pressed his foot against the door, preventing her from closing it, and said calmly but firmly that it would be better to let them in voluntarily. Otherwise, they would enter by force. Nina let them in, afraid of a scandal and of the neighbors hearing, calling the police, and causing problems. The 3 men entered the apartment and closed the door. Bury walked into the room, sat down on the sofa, and gestured for Nina to sit opposite him. His 2 men remained standing by the door, guarding the exit. Barry took some papers out of his jacket's inside pocket and put them on the table. He said that these were the documents for the apartment, that he needed the apartment for a particular matter, and that Nina had to sign a deed of gift, formally and voluntarily, transferring the condo to his acquaintance for a symbolic amount. In return, he promised to give her another place to live, a room in a dormitory or a small apartment on the outskirts, later, when it became available. Nina Alexeyevna was in shock. She didn't understand why he wanted her apartment, what the matter was, or why he had come to her specifically. She refused categorically, saying that she would not sign anything, that this was the only home she and her son had, that they would have nowhere else to live. Barry listened, nodded, and said that he understood her position, but that she had to understand his. If she did not sign voluntarily, other methods of persuasion would be used, not necessarily against her, perhaps against her son, who worked at the hospital and walked home in the evenings. Something could happen to him, an accident, an attack. The city had become dangerous. Nina turned pale, realizing this was a direct, unambiguous threat. She asked for time to think, saying she couldn't decide right now and needed to consult with her son. Barry looked at her for a long time, then said he would give her 3 days. If she didn't sign in for 3 days, there would be consequences. He stood up and headed for the door, but he stopped at the door, turned around, and looked at Nina again. Something else appeared in his eyes, not businesslike, but personal, predatory. He walked back slowly and told his people to go out into the hallway and wait there. They left and closed the room's door. Nina realized that something terrible was about to happen and tried to get up and run away. But Brown was faster. He grabbed her by the arm, pulled her toward him, and covered her mouth with his other hand to keep her from screaming. He pushed her onto the sofa and threw his weight on top of her. Nina tried to resist, scratching and writhing, but she didn't have enough strength. Barry was several times stronger, a trained boxer accustomed to violence. He raped her there, on the sofa, in her own apartment, brutally, quickly, without words. When he finished, he got up, straightened his clothes, looked at her lying there in tears, and said that it was a bonus, so that she would better understand the seriousness of the situation. That if she didn't sign the documents, it would be worse, perhaps not only for her, but also for her son. He left, slamming the door behind him. Nina lay on the sofa, unable to move, in a state of shock. She didn't know how much time had passed, maybe an hour, maybe less. Then she got up, went to the bathroom, washed herself for a long time with hot water, trying to wash away, to erase what had happened. She changed her clothes, lay down in bed, pulled the blanket over her head, and lay there staring at the ceiling, not crying, just staring into the void. When Alexei returned from his shift in the morning, around 8 o'clock, he found his mother in bed, pale, with a vacant look in her eyes. He asked what had happened and whether she was sick. Nina replied that she was just tired, hadn't slept well, and that it was nothing serious. Alexei believed her, thinking that it was just normal fatigue accumulated over years of a difficult life. He made her some tea, brought it to her in bed, and went to sleep himself. Over the next few days, Nina hardly left her room. She didn't go to work, but called in sick, saying she had a fever and the flu. She hardly ate anything and refused the food Alexei brought her. He became seriously worried and suggested calling a doctor. Nina refused, saying she would get better on her own and just needed time. A week later, when her condition had not improved, Alexei finally called a doctor to the house. A friend of theirs, a therapist from the same hospital, came, examined Nina, measured her blood pressure, and listened to her lungs and heart. Physically, everything was normal, but her psychological state was cause for concern. She recommended consulting a psychologist or psychiatrist, saying that it looked like depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, similar to what happens after severe stress. Alexei asked his mother directly what had happened to traumatize her so much. Nina remained silent, looking away, tears streaming down her cheeks, but saying nothing. Alexei did not insist. He did not want to pressure her and decided to give her time, thinking that when she was ready, she would tell him herself. 2 weeks later, something happened that forced Nina to break her silence. On 10th April, a note was slipped into the apartment's mailbox, written in uneven handwriting on a sheet of school notebook paper. The text was short. The deadline had passed. The documents had not been signed. This was the last warning. If she did not show up at a specific address with the documents tomorrow, it would be too late. Her son would not live to see the following week. Nina read the note. Her hands trembled, her breathing quickened, and she began to panic. Alexei was at home, heard his mother breathing heavily, gasping for air, ran into the room, and saw her pale, with blue lips, gasping for air. He called an ambulance, which arrived quickly. The doctors gave her an injection, a sedative, and stopped the attack, but suggested she be hospitalized. Nina refused, saying she would stay at home and that her son, a doctor, would take care of her. When they were alone, Alexei took his mother's hands, looked her in the eyes, and said that he could no longer watch her suffer, that she had to tell him what had happened, what was threatening her, what the note was about. Nina looked at him for a long time, then cried, broke down, and began to tell him everything. She told him everything, about Burgo's visit, about the demand to sign the documents, about the rape, about the threats. She spoke quietly, pausing, ashamed, but she told him everything. Alexei listened, his face growing paler and paler, his hands clenching into fists, his jaws clenching. When her mother finished, he sat silently for a minute or two, then got up, left the room, and locked himself in his room. Nina heard him walking around, dropping something, banging his fist on the table. Then, silence. He came out half an hour later, his face calm and cold, his eyes hard. He told his mother that she shouldn't worry anymore, that he would sort things out and make sure Burry never bothered them again. Nina tried to stop him, saying that he shouldn't do anything, that it was dangerous, that Burry would kill him if he went against him. Alexei hugged his mother and said that he knew what he was doing, that she should trust him. Alexei Kovalev was not a violent man. He had never been in a fight in his life, avoided conflicts, and solved problems with words, or simply by walking away from the situation. But now words were powerless, and walking away was impossible. He understood that if he didn't stop Burry, he would continue, take the apartment, and maybe do something to his mother again, or to him. The police wouldn't help. Everyone knew that Burry was untouchable, protected, that testimony was pointless, that the case would not be opened or would be closed in a month due to lack of evidence. There was only one way left, to do himself what the law would not do. But how? Physically, he could not stand up to Brown, a former boxer surrounded by bodyguards. He did not know how to shoot, he had no weapon, and murder with a gun was the first thing the police would check for. They would find it and put him in jail. He needed a way that would leave no traces, that would look like an accident or a medical error, for which it would be difficult to hold anyone accountable in the chaos of the 90s, when medical errors were common due to a lack of equipment and medicines. Alexei began to observe Burry, learning his habits and the places he frequented. It turned out that Burry was not as invulnerable as he seemed. He had health problems that few people knew about. Varicose veins in the lower extremities, stage 3, are a disease common among people who stand a lot or have a genetic predisposition. Burry wore compression stockings under his pants, hiding the problem, but the pain was severe and made it difficult to walk, especially in the evening. Alexei found out about this by accident. He overheard a nurse in the hospital telling a colleague that a confident Sergei, surname such and such, age 35, was to be admitted to the surgical department for routine varicose vein removal, referred by a vascular surgeon from Voronezh. Alexei checked the records and found the patient's file. Sergei Burov, his real surname given to him by his parents, but in criminal circles, he was known only by his nickname. The operation was scheduled for 25th of April, 2 weeks later. It was a standard procedure: phlebectomy, removal of the affected veins through small incisions, under local anesthesia or light sedation, lasting 1 to 2 hours, with recovery taking several days. The department's chief surgeon, an experienced doctor, was to operate, but Alexei, his assistant, would be in the operating room to help. Alexei had a plan. It was terrible, cruel, but in his mind, it was fair. He wouldn't kill Burry. That would be too easy for him, too quick. He would make sure that Burry suffered as much as his mother had suffered, humiliation for humiliation, injury for violence. And he would do it in a way that would make it impossible to prove malicious intent, so it would appear to be a medical error or a decision made at a critical moment during the operation. Alexei spent 2 weeks preparing himself psychologically. He rehearsed in his mind how he would act, what he would say if asked. He studied the legal aspects of medical errors and read articles and case studies. He understood that if he did everything right, the worst he would face was dismissal and loss of his license, but not prison or criminal charges, because it is tough to prove intent in a medical error. On the morning of 25 April 1993, Sergei Burov arrived at the hospital. He arrived in a black Volga with 2 bodyguards who remained in the car at the entrance. He went to the reception, filled out the paperwork, was taken to a room in the surgical ward, given hospital pajamas, and told that the operation would be after lunch, that he should not eat or drink anything in the morning, and that an anesthesiologist would come before the operation to explain the procedure. Barry was calm, even relaxed. It was a routine operation with minimal risks. Thousands of such operations are performed every year, and complications are rare. He thought that in a week he would be discharged, return to work, and forget about the pain in his legs that had tormented him for the last 2 years. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he was wheeled into the operating room on a gurney. The operating room was standard. White walls, bright lights, a table in the center, instruments on tables around it, anesthesia, and vital signs monitoring equipment. The surgical team consisted of the chief surgeon, Alexei, as an assistant, an anesthesiologist, and a surgical nurse. Barry was laid on the operating table. The anesthesiologist put in an IV, administered a sedative and local anesthetic to the area of the operation, and numbed the leg where the veins would be removed. Burio felt his consciousness clouding over, sinking into a semi-sleep, hearing the doctor's voices but unable to make out the words, unable to move, his body not responding. The chief surgeon began the operation. He made incisions in the leg, began isolating the affected veins, clamping them, and removing them. Alexei assisted, handed instruments, monitored bleeding, and applied pressure. The operation proceeded as usual, without complications. About an hour passed when the central part was completed, the veins were removed, and all that remained was to suture the incisions. And then Alexei said that he had noticed something that needed to be checked. He pointed to the groin area and said that he saw signs of an inguinal hernia, a slight bulge that could become a problem in the future. Since the patient was already on the table under anesthesia, they could check it out. It would be worth suturing the hernia right away to avoid a repeat operation. The chief surgeon looked, saw no obvious signs, but Alexei insisted, saying that he had seen something similar before and that it was better to be safe than sorry. The chief surgeon agreed and noted Alexei could check while he sutured the leg incisions. Alexei made a small incision in the groin area, slightly higher than necessary to check for a hernia. His hands were steady, his movements confident. Years of training and hundreds of surgeries, both observed and performed under supervision, had given him a skill that he now used not for salvation, but for revenge. He cut through the tissue, reached the cavernous bodies of the penis and the arteries that supply it with blood. And he did what he had decided to do 2 weeks ago. He squeezed and cut the blood vessels that feed the penis with one precise, irreversible movement. The bleeding was instantaneous, but controllable. Alexei quickly applied clamps to stop the blood, but the damage was critical. Deprived of blood supply, the penis began to turn pale, the tissue began to die, and necrosis developed rapidly. 10 minutes later, it became clear that the organ was not viable. It started to turn black, and the smell of necrosis became apparent. Alexei turned to the chief surgeon, showed him what had happened, and said that during the incision, he had accidentally damaged the arteries, that the blood supply was critically impaired, that the tissue was dying, and that the only way out was amputation to prevent sepsis, which would develop if the necrotic tissue was left in place. The chief surgeon was shocked. In 30 years of practice, he had never seen such a thing, that during a simple operation to remove veins in the leg, the arteries of the penis were accidentally damaged. But the fact was, before his eyes, necrosis, blackening tissue, the smell. There was no time to waste. Sepsis could develop within hours and lead to death. The decision was made to amputate and save the patient's life, even at such a cost. Alexei performed the amputation. He cut off the penis at the base, carefully and professionally, sutured the stump, stopped the bleeding, and treated it with antiseptics. The whole process took 20 minutes. Bori was sedated the entire time, feeling nothing, unaware of what was happening. When the operation was over, Bori was transferred to the intensive care unit and began to come out of anesthesia. He woke up an hour later, still in a daze, not immediately understanding where he was. He felt pain in his leg where the veins had been removed, but that was to be expected. Then he began to feel a strange sensation, a lack of something, an emptiness in his groin area. He tried to move his legs, to feel his body. His hand instinctively reached down, thought through the sheet. Nothing. A flat surface, bandages, but nothing that should have been there. Panic seized me instantly. I started screaming, calling for the nurse, the doctor, demanding an explanation. The nurse came running, tried to calm me down, and said that the doctor would come soon and explain. A few minutes later, the chief surgeon arrived, his face grim and guilty. He explained that there had been a complication during the operation, unforeseen damage to the arteries, that necrosis had developed, that amputation was necessary to save his life, and that there was no other option. Barry listened, not believing, not understanding. How was this possible? He came in to have veins removed from his leg and woke up without a penis. How could this have happened? He demanded to see precisely what had been damaged, how it had happened, and who was to blame. The chief surgeon explained in medical terms, talking about an accidental incision, damage to blood vessels, rapid necrosis, and the impossibility of restoring the blood supply. He said that this happens, albeit rarely, and that it is a complication for which doctors are not technically criminally liable if they act in accordance with protocol to save a life. Barry realized that his life had changed forever. The man who had kept the city in fear, who was proud of his strength and masculinity, woke up castrated, incomplete. The humiliation was complete, absolute. And worst of all, he couldn't even take revenge, didn't know who was to blame, whether it was really an accident or someone's deliberate act. The chief surgeon looked genuinely upset, while his assistant, a young doctor with glasses whom Barry didn't even remember, having paid no attention to him during the operation, stood aside, silent and impassive. 3 days after the operation, on 28th April, Alexei and Nina disappeared from Borisogledsk. The apartment was closed, some of their belongings had been taken away, and neighbors said they saw them leaving with suitcases early in the morning and getting into a taxi. No one knew where they had gone. Barry, still lying in the hospital, learned of their disappearance through his people. He immediately realized that this was no coincidence. The woman he had raped a month ago, from whom he had demanded an apartment, and the surgeon who had assisted in the operation, were mother and son. He realized that his castration was not an accident, but revenge, planned, cold, performed by the hands of a professional surgeon, so that there would be no evidence. Everything looked like a medical error. His rage was boundless. He threw all his energy into the search. His people combed the city and the surrounding areas, questioned everyone who might have seen Alexei or Nina, checked train stations, bus stations, and the airport in Voronezh. He called in his connections in the police, who searched databases, checked registrations, tickets, and travel records. Nothing. Alexei and Nina had vanished as if they had never existed. A week later, Barry was discharged from the hospital and returned to business. But everything had changed. His authority had been undermined. Rumors of his injury had spread throughout the city, and other groups had begun to raise their heads and challenge his territory. In the criminal world, weakness is not forgiven, and a castrated authority is no authority at all. He was laughed at, and his respect evaporated in a matter of weeks. He tried to maintain his position through force and cruelty, but it didn't help. The gang was falling apart, and people were leaving for competitors. 6 months later, Barry left Borisogledsk and moved to another city, rumored to be Moscow, where no one knew him and where he could start from scratch. But no longer as an authority figure. but as an ordinary person, disabled and broken. He continued searching for Alexei and Nina for several more years, hiring private detectives, placing advertisements, and offering rewards for information, to no avail. No one knows for sure what happened to Alexei and Nina. There are theories that they went to Siberia, changed their names, and live quietly there, with Alexei working in some remote hospital under a different name, and Nina retired. Others say that they went abroad, to Germany or Israel, where Nina had distant relatives, settled there, and live an everyday life. Still others believe that they were found and killed, but their bodies were never found and were buried somewhere in the forest. But none of these theories has been confirmed. Neither Alexei nor Nina ever reappeared in Borysoglebsk, never contacted their former acquaintances, and left no trace. It was as if they had disappeared from the face of the earth on that April day in 1993, when everything changed. According to the latest data, Sergei Burov died in 2010 in Moscow at the age of 52 from cirrhosis of the liver. He had been drinking heavily in recent years and lived alone, without a family or children, which he could not have after that operation. He was buried in Vagankovo Cemetery with a simple cross on his grave, no identifying marks of his criminal past. The chief surgeon who operated retired in 1998 and died in 2005 of a heart attack. Until the end of his life, he considered that operation to be the most tragic mistake of his career, blaming himself for not noticing, not preventing it. However, objectively, he could not have done anything, as he had acted according to protocol. This story became a warning and a lesson, a warning to those who consider themselves untouchable, who think that power and connections will protect them from any revenge. A lesson to those who believe in justice, which sometimes comes not from the law, but from the hands of those who have been pushed to the edge, who have lost everything except the desire to punish their offender. In March 1994, an event occurred in a communal apartment on the outskirts of Saratov that shocked not only the building's residents, but the entire country. 53-year-old Valentina Sergeyevna, a single mother who had raised 2 sons in poverty and deprivation, committed an act that some would call an act of desperate self-defense. In contrast, others would call it a monstrous crime. On 7th March, neighbors found her in the kitchen of their shared apartment, calmly drinking tea from a faceted glass. There was blood everywhere. Her sons, 28-year-old Andrei and 25-year-old Victor, were lying in the next room. Both were alive, but mutilated. Their mother had castrated them both with a kitchen knife while they were asleep after drinking vodka laced with a hefty dose of sleeping pills. When the police asked her why she had done it, Valentina replied, "So they wouldn't reproduce anymore." If you are interested in stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are listening to us from. In the mid-1990s, Saratov was a typical Russian city experiencing a severe crisis. Factories were shut down, salaries were not paid for months, and crime was rampant in the streets. People survived as best they could. Some traded at the market, some became shuttle traders, some drank themselves to death or turned to drugs. Life was hard, especially for people like Valentina Sergeyevna. She lived in a communal apartment on the 4th floor of a 5-story panel building on Rabachaya Street. The apartment was a typical communal flat, a long corridor, 7 rooms, 1 kitchen for everyone, 1 toilet, and 1 bathroom. 12 people from 6 families lived in the apartment. Valentina occupied a small room measuring 9 square meters. She lived in this room with her 2 adult sons. Valentina was born in 1941 in a village near Saratov. The war took her father when she was 2 years old. Her mother raised 3 children alone, working on a collective farm from dawn to dusk. Life was hungry and cold, but they survived. Valentina finished 7 grades of school, then went to work at a factory. At 18, she met a man, Nikolai, who worked there as a mechanic. They got married, and a year later, their first son, Andrei, was born. 3 years later, their second son, Victor, was born. Nikolai drank. Not much at first on weekends with friends. But over the years, he drank more and more. He drank away his salary, caused scandals at home, and sometimes beat his wife. Valentina endured it, as many women did in those days. Divorce was considered shameful, and where could she go with 2 small children? In 1972, Nikolai died. He was drunk and fell under a tram. Valentina was 31 years old and had 2 sons, ages 8 and 5. She was left alone. For the next 20 years, Valentina worked tirelessly. She worked as a seamstress in the factory's workshop, sewing work clothes. The salary was small, but it was enough to live on. She raised her sons alone and tried to give them everything she could. She fed them, clothed them, and made sure they studied. They lived in a dormitory at the factory, 1 room for 3, with shared facilities in the hallway. Her sons grew up like normal boys. Andrei was quiet and withdrawn, with average grades. Victor was more lively and sociable, but also without any particular talents. Both finished 8th grade and went to vocational school. Andrei studied to be a turner, Victor a mechanic. After school, both got jobs at the factory where their mother worked. It seemed that life was getting better. Valentina got a room in a communal apartment, which was a blessing at the time. It was only 9 square meters, but it was hers, and she had a residence permit. Her sons worked and brought home a salary. Valentina dreamed that her sons would soon get married and move out, and that she would finally be able to live peacefully in her old age. But at the end of the 80s, everything began to fall apart. Perestroika, crisis, the factory started to malfunction. Salaries were delayed, and then they began paying only part of them. In 1991, the factory shut down completely. Valentina and thousands of other workers found themselves out of work. Andrei was 25 at the time, and Victor was 22. Both lost their jobs at the factory. They tried to find something else, but there were no jobs anywhere. They started drinking. At first, it was out of idleness and despair. Then, it became a habit. Valentina tried to talk some sense into them. She said they needed to look for work, any work, as long as it paid. But her sons wouldn't listen. They said there were no jobs, that the country was falling apart, that there was no point in living. They drank everything they could find: vodka, cologne, tinctures. They took money for booze from their mother. Valentina received a small unemployment benefit and tried to feed 3 adults on those pennies. By 1992, the situation had worsened. Andrei and Victor got involved with the wrong crowd and started using drugs. At first it was marijuana, then they moved on to hard drugs, heroin, which was flooding into Russia in those years. Heroin was cheap, accessible, and deadly. The neighbors in their communal apartment began to complain. The brothers constantly brought strange people home, partied until morning, made noise, and littered the shared kitchen. Sometimes things disappeared from the apartment. One of the brothers' guests was stealing. The neighbors demanded that Valentina do something, but what could she do? They were her sons, grown men, physically strong. She couldn't control them. Valentina got a job as a cleaner at a school. The pay was low, but at least it was something. She got up at 5 in the morning, cleaned the classrooms and corridors, then ran home to cook lunch. Her sons slept during the day after partying all night, woke up in the evening, and demanded food. If there was no food, or it wasn't what they wanted, they started yelling and sometimes threw plates. Valentina kept quiet and endured it. Money was constantly disappearing. Valentina hid her salary, but her sons always found it. They searched the room when she was away and took everything, down to the last penny. They did not consider what she needed to buy food and pay for utilities. They needed money for drugs and vodka. Everything else was unimportant. Her neighbor, Lydia Petrovna, an older woman who lived in the next room, recalled, She said that Valentina often came to her to borrow 50 rubles for bread. She said that her sons had taken all her money. Lydia gave her as much as she could, but she herself lived on a meager pension. She saw bruises on Valentina's face and asked what had happened. Valentina replied that she had fallen and hit herself. But Lydia knew the truth. Her sons were beating their mother. It started in 1993. Andrei was the first to raise his hand against his mother. It was about money, as always. Valentina hid her salary and refused to give it to him. She said they had to pay for the apartment, otherwise they would be evicted. Andrei started shouting and demanding money. When his mother refused again, he hit her in the face. Valentina fell and cut her lip on the edge of the table. Victor did not stand up for his mother. On the contrary, he joined his brother and began searching the room. They found the money, took it, and left. They returned 2 days later, drunk and dirty, demanding food. Valentina fed them. What else could she do? Since then, the beatings have become regular. Once a week, once every few days, sometimes every day. It depended on the mood of her sons, on how badly they needed money. Valentina tried to defend herself. But what could she, a short 50-year-old woman, exhausted by work and hunger, do against 2 healthy men? She went to the police. She filed 2 complaints against her sons. But in the 90s, the police could do little to help. The local officers arrived, spoke with her sons, and warned them. Andrei and Victor promised to mend their ways. As soon as the police left, they attacked their mother with renewed vigor, saying that she was a snitch and that she would suffer for it. The neighbors were of little help either. Everyone was preoccupied with their own problems. The 1990s were a time when everyone was struggling to survive, and no one cared about other people's misfortunes. Besides, many people were afraid of the brothers. Andrei and Victor were known in the neighborhood as dangerous characters with ties to crime. No one wanted to get involved with them. Valentina thought about leaving, but where would she go? She had no money and no relatives who would take her in. She was tied to this room, to this house. It was all she had. By the end of 1993, the situation had reached a breaking point. The sons didn't just drink and shoot up. They started bringing women home, prostitutes from the highway, drug addicts from their circles. They brought them into their mother's room, onto her only bed. Valentina was kicked out into the hallway or the kitchen and forced to sleep there. The neighbors were outraged and made a fuss, but the brothers didn't care. They lived in their own world, where there were no laws, no morals, no respect. There were only drugs, vodka, and violence. In January 1994, an incident occurred that was the last straw for many neighbors. Andrei and Victor brought 2 women and had a drinking party in the room. The music blared until 3 in the morning. The neighbors banged on the walls, demanding silence. In response, Andrei came out into the hallway with a knife, threatening to kill anyone who interfered. The police were called. A patrol arrived, drew up a report, and took the brothers to the station. But after a day, they were released due to a lack of evidence. When they returned, they trashed their mother's room. They broke all the dishes, tore her clothes, and broke her only chair. Valentina sat in the kitchen and cried. Lydia Petrovna said she saw Valentina that night. The older woman couldn't sleep after the scandal and went to the kitchen to drink some water. Valentina was sitting by the window, staring into the darkness. Lydia asked if she wanted some tea. Valentina agreed. They sat together in the kitchen, drinking tea from faceted glasses. Valentina said then that she couldn't live like this anymore, that it would be better to die than to endure this any longer. Lydia tried to calm her down, saying that everything would work out, that she needed to be patient. But Valentina shook her head. She said that they would kill her sooner or later. It would have been better if she hadn't given birth to them. February 1994 was tough. The frosts were severe, reaching -25 degrees. The heating in the house was weak, and the radiators were barely warm. Valentina caught a cold, and her temperature rose, but she still went to work. She desperately needed money to pay for the apartment and buy food. Her sons were particularly aggressive at that time. Andre got hold of a gun somewhere, waved it around, and threatened everyone. He said that if his mother didn't give him money, he would shoot her. Valentina believed that he was capable of doing it. On 3rd March, another scandal occurred. Valentina received her salary, a total of 250,000 rubles in old money. At that time, it was a pittance, enough for a week of meager food. She hid the money in the lining of her coat, hoping that her sons would not find it. But they found it. They searched through all her things while she was at work. When Valentina returned in the evening, her sons were already drunk. Andre waved his empty wallet and shouted that his mother was a fool for hiding money from them. Victor joined in and began to insult his mother, calling her the dirtiest names. Then they started beating her. Andre punched her in the face and stomach. Victor kicked her when she fell. Valentina screamed and begged them to stop, but they didn't. They beat her for a long time until they got tired. Then they left, slamming the door behind them. Valentina lay on the floor for several hours. She couldn't get up. Her whole body ached. Through the window, she could see the sky darkening and the occasional streetlights coming on in the courtyard. The room was cold and quiet. Only her breathing and occasional sobs could be heard. By midnight, she was able to get up. She made it to the bed and lay down without undressing. Her face was burning, her ribs hurt, and they might have been broken. But she didn't go to the hospital. Why? The doctors would ask what happened. She would tell the truth. And then what? Nothing would change. That night, lying in the dark, Valentina made a decision. She would no longer endure it. She would not wait for her sons to kill her. She would end it herself. The next day, 4th March, Valentina went to the pharmacy. She bought a strong sleeping pill, phenazepam. In those days, many medicines were sold without a prescription, and pharmacists did not ask unnecessary questions. She purchased 3 packs at once. The pharmacist asked why she needed so many. Valentina replied that she had insomnia and that her doctor had prescribed it. At home, she hid the pills in her apron pocket. She waited for the right moment. On March 5th and 6th, her sons did not come home. They went somewhere, perhaps to friends, possibly to get high. Valentina hoped that they would not return at all, but she knew they would. They always came back. On Wednesday evening, 7th of March, Andre and Victor returned. They were angry, sober, and demanded food. Valentina cooked potatoes with onions, everything she had. She fed them. They ate silently, quickly, then demanded vodka. There was no vodka. Valentina said she didn't have money to buy any. Andre started shouting and raised his hand to hit her. Valentina quickly said she could go to the neighbor and ask to borrow some. Andre agreed and told her to go. Valentina went to Lydia Petrovna and asked to borrow 100,000 rubles. Lydia gave her the last money she had. Valentina went down to the courtyard, went into a kiosk, and bought a bottle of the cheapest vodka. She returned home. Her sons were already sitting at the table, waiting. Valentina put the bottle on the table. Andre opened it and poured it into glasses. He offered his mother a drink. Valentina refused, saying she didn't drink. Victor laughed and said she was stupid. They started drinking. Valentina sat on the bed and watched. After the 3rd shot, Andre went to the bathroom. This was the moment Valentina had been waiting for. She quickly took the pills out of her apron pocket and crushed them with a spoon into powder right in her palm. While Victor was looking out the window, she poured the powder into the vodka bottle. She shook the bottle, and the powder dissolved. Andre returned from the bathroom. They continued drinking. Valentina went to the kitchen, pretending to wash the dishes. In reality, she couldn't bear to watch. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was beating so hard, it felt like it was going to jump out of her chest. Half an hour later, she returned to the room. The brothers were sitting at the table, listless and sleepy. Andrei was yawning and saying he was tired. Victor was already nodding off. 10 minutes later, they both passed out. Andrei fell face down on the table. Victor collapsed on the floor next to his chair. Valentina approached and shook Andrei's shoulder. No response. She shook Victor. Still no response. They were in a deep, almost comatose sleep. Valentina looked at her watch. It was around 9 in the evening. The hallway was quiet. The neighbors were in their rooms. There was no one in the kitchen. She returned to the room and locked the door. She walked over to the table where the leftovers and an empty bottle lay. She picked up a large kitchen knife, the one she used to cut meat when they still had meat. She sat down on the bed, holding the knife in her hands. She looked at her sleeping sons. They lay helpless, defenseless. She could do anything she wanted. She sat there for about 10 minutes, thinking. They were her children. She had given birth to them, raised them, and loved them. When they were little, she stayed up at night when they were sick. She sang them lullabies, kissed their bruises, and taught them to walk and talk. But those little boys had died, long ago. Instead, there were these 2 drug addicts, alcoholics, and rapists. They were no longer her sons. They were monsters who had turned her life into hell. Valentina stood up. She walked over to Victor, who was lying on the floor. She unbuttoned his pants and pulled them down. He didn't move, breathing heavily. She raised the knife. Her hand didn't tremble. All she felt was cold determination. She knew exactly what to do. She had been thinking about it for the last few days, imagining every movement. One quick movement. Blood spurted out. Victor twitched in his sleep, groaned, but did not wake up. The sleeping pills kept him firmly asleep. Valentina moved on to Andrei. She did the same thing. Andrei did not even move. When it was all over, Valentina stood up and looked at her hands. They were covered in blood. So was the knife. She put the knife on the table and wiped her hands on her apron. Pools of blood were spreading across the floor, but she paid no attention. Valentina left the room and went to the kitchen. She washed her hands in the sink with cold water. The water ran pink, then clear. She dried her hands with an old towel and put the kettle on the stove. When the water boiled, she brewed tea in a faceted glass. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where she had sat with Lydia Petrovna a month ago. She began to drink her tea slowly, in small sips. It was peaceful. For the first time in many years, she felt calm. Around 11 o'clock in the evening, Lydia Petrovna came into the kitchen. She wanted to drink some water before going to bed. She saw Valentina sitting at the table. She wanted to say hello, but froze. There were large dark stains on Valentina's apron. At first, Lydia didn't understand what they were. Then she realized. She asked what had happened. Valentina calmly replied that she had mutilated her sons. Now they would not be able to reproduce, would not be able to make other women as unhappy as she had been. Lydia did not believe her. She thought Valentina had gone mad and was talking nonsense. But Valentina repeated herself, now in more detail. She told her what she had done, how she had done it, and why she had done it. Lydia ran to call the police. There was one telephone in the communal apartment's hallway. She dialed 02 and reported in a trembling voice that a crime had been committed in their apartment, and that they needed to come immediately. The police arrived 20 minutes later. 2 patrol cars, 4 officers. They entered the apartment, and Lydia showed them where Valentina's room was. The police went inside and turned on the light. The scene was horrific. 2 men were lying in pools of blood, one on the floor, the other on a chair, his head fallen onto the table. Both were conscious and moaning. A bloody knife lay on the floor. The police called an ambulance and began to administer first aid. One of them went into the kitchen, where Valentina was still sitting. He asked if she had done it. Valentina nodded. She said she had done it, and had no regrets. The police officer handcuffed her and led her out into the hallway. The neighbors had already woken up from the noise and were looking out of their rooms. Valentina was led down the hallway, and she walked calmly, even with dignity. She did not resist, cry, or scream. The ambulance arrived, and the doctors took Andre and Victor away. Both were in serious condition from blood loss, but alive. They were taken to the hospital, where they underwent emergency surgery. The doctors were able to stop the bleeding and stitch up the wounds. The brothers' lives were saved, but they were no longer men in the complete sense of the word. Valentina was taken to the police station. There she gave detailed testimony. She told everything about the years of abuse, the beatings, the threats, how her sons had turned her life into hell. She told how she made the decision, how she bought the sleeping pills, how she slipped them into the vodka, how she did what she did. The investigator, a man in his 40s, listened to her, unsure what to think. On the one hand, it was a serious crime, intentional infliction of grievous bodily harm. On the other hand, the woman was defending herself against a real threat to her life. Her sons were known in the neighborhood as dangerous individuals, with several open and closed cases against them. The investigator himself could understand the mother's desperation. Valentina was arrested and placed in a detention center. The investigation began. News of the incident quickly spread throughout the city, then reached the regional and then the national media. In 1994, such stories were worth their weight in gold: shocking, cruel, and true to life. Journalists besieged the detention center, trying to get an interview with Valentina. She refused to talk to the press. Only a month later did she agree to give one interview to a local newspaper correspondent. In the interview, she repeated her story. She said she did not regret what she had done, that if she hadn't done it, they would have killed her. That, at least, other women would not now suffer at their hands. When asked if her conscience bothered her, she replied that her conscience had tormented her all these years while she endured the abuse. Now, she was at peace. The interview was published and caused a considerable stir. Public opinion was divided. Some considered Valentina a heroine who defended herself in the only way available to her. Others called her a monster who maimed her own children. People in the city began collecting signatures in Valentina's defense. Women, many of whom had themselves suffered from domestic violence, picketed outside the courthouse, demanding her release. They said that Valentina was a victim, not a criminal. But there were also opponents. Human rights activists said the law should be the same for everyone and that no circumstances justify such cruelty. The church condemned Valentina's actions, calling them a sin incompatible with Christian morality. Andre and Victor were in the hospital under guard. When their condition stabilized, they were also questioned. Both accused their mother of attempted murder and demanded the maximum punishment. They denied that they had abused her. They said that their mother had gone mad, that they just drank sometimes, that nothing extraordinary had happened. But the investigation gathered substantial evidence to the contrary. Neighbors testified about constant scandals, beatings, and that Valentina regularly asked them for food and money because her sons took everything away from her. A medical examination revealed numerous old injuries on Valentina's body: broken ribs, traces of blows. The local police officer confirmed that Valentina had twice filed complaints against her sons. The investigation also established that both brothers were registered with a drug treatment center and had problems with the law: theft, hooliganism, and threats. This worked in Valentina's favor, showing that she truly lived in fear and despair. The trial began in June 1994. The hearings were held in the Saratov Regional Court. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and curious onlookers. Everyone was interested to see how the judges would decide this complex case. Valentina looked exhausted and aged. 3 months in a detention center had taken its toll. She had lost weight, and her hair had turned even grayer. But she remained calm, and dignified. She answered questions clearly and without emotion. The prosecutor demanded a harsh punishment. He said that Valentina had committed a serious crime with particular cruelty, that she had not simply defended herself, but had cold-bloodedly maimed two people, depriving them of the opportunity to have children. He asked for an 8-year prison sentence. The defense insisted on leniency. The lawyer, a young woman named Irina, who was working for free, said that Valentina had acted in a state of affect caused by systematic violence, that she had exhausted all legal means of defense, that the police had not helped, that she had no other choice. She requested a suspended sentence, or the minimum punishment. The witnesses gave contradictory testimony. The neighbors mostly supported Valentina and talked about what she had been through. Lydia Petrovna cried in the courtroom and said that Valentina was a saintly woman and that no one had the right to judge her after what she had been through. Andrei and Victor were also present at the trial. Both had difficulty walking and were on crutches. Doctors said that their physical functions would be partially restored, but their reproductive capacity was lost forever. The brothers looked at their mother with hatred and demanded punishment. They said that she was a monster and that they would never forgive her. A psychiatric examination found Valentina to be sane. The conclusion stated that she was aware of the nature and social danger of her actions and was able to control them. There were no signs of mental illness or emotional distress. This was a blow to the defense. If the examination did not recognize affect, then the crime was premeditated and cold-blooded. And that is an aggravating circumstance. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Every day, the media published reports on the hearings. Television showed reports. Psychologists, lawyers, and human rights activists discussed the case in studios. Opinions were divided. Psychologist Marina Kay said that Valentina was a victim of battered woman syndrome, that years of violence had destroyed her psyche, and that her actions were a desperate attempt to survive. Lawyer Sergei P. objected that the law makes no exceptions for victims, that Valentina should have gone to court, sought to have her son's right to live with her revoked, and found legal means of protection. Priest Father Vladimir said that Valentina had committed a grave sin, that she must repent, that no circumstances justify such cruelty. Feminist Olga T. said that Valentina was a symbol of all women suffering from domestic violence, that society should support her, not condemn her. The discussions were heated, sometimes turning into shouting matches. Everyone had their own opinion, and everyone was convinced they were right. The verdict was handed down on 28 June 1994. The judge, an older woman with a stern face, read out the court's decision. Valentina Sergeyevna was found guilty of intentionally causing grievous bodily harm to 2 persons with particular cruelty. Taking into account mitigating circumstances, systematic violence on the part of the victims, no previous convictions, difficult living conditions, the court sentenced her to 5 years imprisonment in a general regime colony. The courtroom erupted. Activists shouted that it was unfair, that 5 years was too much. The prosecutor was dissatisfied, considering the punishment too lenient. Valentina listened to the verdict calmly, without showing any emotion. She was led away. She turned at the door and looked at the courtroom one last time. Among the crowd, she saw Lydia Petrovna waving at her. Valentina nodded slightly and left. Valentina was transferred to a women's colony in Engels, a suburb of Saratov. She spent the next 5 years there. According to her cellmates, she kept to herself, worked in the sewing workshop, and hardly communicated with anyone. No one wrote her letters or sent her packages. She was utterly alone. After the trial, Andrei and Victor gradually disappeared from public view. For a while, they tried to live in the same communal apartment, but their neighbors staged a collective protest and demanded that they be evicted. A year later, the brothers moved out and settled somewhere else in the city. Their lives did not improve. Andrei continued to use drugs and died of an overdose in 1996. He was 30 years old. Victor outlived his brother by 2 years. In 1998, he was found dead in the basement of one of the houses. The cause of death was hypothermia and alcohol poisoning. He was 29. When Valentina was informed of her son's deaths, she showed no emotion. She did not cry or say anything. She just listened and went back to work. In 1999, Valentina was released on parole for good behavior. She left the colony as a 58-year-old woman, aged, sick, and broken by life. She returned to Saratov. She tried to return to her old communal apartment, but couldn't. Her neighbors didn't want to see her. Too many memories were associated with that place, and the room was already occupied by other people. Valentina wandered for some time, spending the night in shelters and with casual acquaintances. In 2001, she found a place in a nursing home. She lived there for the rest of her life, quietly and unnoticed. Valentina died of cancer in 2009. She was 68 years old. The funeral was modest, attended by a few people from the nursing home. None of her relatives came. She had no relatives. All her sons were dead. Valentina's story became one of the most talked about criminal stories of the 1990s. It touched on topics that were painful for the whole society: domestic violence, drug addiction, the helplessness of law enforcement agencies, and moral choices in extreme circumstances. Some saw Valentina as a heroine who found the strength to resist. Others saw her as a cruel criminal who mutilated her own children. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Valentina was an ordinary woman who had been placed in impossible circumstances by life. She tried to survive, raise her children alone, work, and endure. When it became impossible to endure, when all legal means of protection failed, she chose a terrible path. A path that destroyed everyone's lives, her own and her son's. Can she be justified? The law has spoken. She is guilty. She has been punished. But morality is not as clear-cut as the law. What should a woman do when she has been beaten, robbed, and humiliated by her own children for years? Where can she go when the police are powerless, when society is indifferent, when there is no help? In an ideal world, Valentina could have left her sons, found protection, and started a new life. But in the real world, in Russia in the 1990s, there were no such opportunities. There was only poverty, violence, and despair. Valentina's story is not just about one woman. It is the story of thousands of women who suffer from domestic violence, who cannot find help, who live in fear. It is a reminder that society must protect its weakest members, that law enforcement agencies must do their job, and that people cannot be left alone with their tormentors. Many years have passed since those events. Russia has changed. Crisis centers for victims of domestic violence and hotlines have appeared, and laws have become stricter. But the problem still exists. Women continue to suffer, and some of them continue to reach the point of despair, where violence seems to be the only way out. Valentina's story should teach us compassion and vigilance. It should teach us to see the suffering of others, to reach out and help, not to walk by, because every Valentina is a failure of society, a failure of the system, a failure of all of us. If you liked the story, please like, subscribe, and write in the comments where you are listening to us from. See you in the next episode. She delivered the babies of generals' wives and businessmen. They left the delivery room paralyzed for life. Doctors blamed complications. But when 40-year-old midwife Elena Martinova was arrested in 1995, it turned out that this was revenge that had been 15 years in the making. Revenge for what had happened to her when she was 20. Revenge that she had methodically carried out in operating rooms while the elite slept peacefully. Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, in the early 1990s was a city of contrasts. Factories stood idle. Salaries went unpaid for months, and queues for bread stretched for hours. But at the same time, new rich people appeared, directors of privatized enterprises, cooperators, officials who seized power at the moment of the collapse of the system. They drove foreign cars, built cottages, and sent their wives to give birth not in ordinary maternity hospitals, but in elite wards where they could get a private room, good food, and the attention of the best doctors. City Maternity Hospital No. 3 on Malisheva Street was considered one such place. It was an old building, constructed during the Stalin era, but with modern equipment for its time, obtained from Germany as part of humanitarian aid. The wives of generals from the Ural Military District, the spouses of major businessmen, and the daughters of regional officials were brought here. The city's best obstetricians worked here, as well as anesthesiologists with many years of experience, and neonatologists who had trained abroad. Among the medical staff was midwife Elena Sergeyevna Martinova. She turned 38 in 1992. She was a short, thin woman with short, dark hair, always neatly trimmed, with delicate features and deep-set gray eyes. She had been working at the maternity hospital since 1980, rising from junior nurse to senior midwife. Her colleagues described her as a high-level professional, calm, collected, never raising her voice, working precisely, without fuss. Patients spoke positively of her, attentive, delicate, able to calm them down in critical moments. Elena's personal life was sparse. She was unmarried, had no children, and lived alone in a two-room apartment in a residential area. Her parents died in the mid-1980s, her father from a heart attack, her mother from cancer. She had no brothers or sisters. She had practically no friends, and her colleagues knew only what was relevant to her work. After her shift, Elena would go home, read medical literature on weekends, or walk around the city. No hobbies, no passions, no romances. Her life was reduced to work and loneliness. But none of her colleagues knew that inside this quiet, inconspicuous woman, rage had been festering for 18 years. Rage that did not fade away, but instead turned into cold, methodical determination. Determination that turned her into one of the cruelest criminals in the history of Soviet and post-Soviet medicine. It all began in 1979. Elena Martinova was 20 years old. She was in her third year at the Sverdlovsk Medical College, training to become a midwife. She was a model student, good grades, responsible, disciplined. She lived in a dormitory and worked part-time as a nurse in a hospital to pay for textbooks and clothes. Her parents helped, but the family was not wealthy. Her father worked as a factory mechanic, and her mother was a store saleswoman. In November 1979, a classmate invited Elena to a party. She said it was a friend's birthday and that there would be interesting people, music, and food. Elena didn't usually attend such events, but her classmate insisted, saying she needed to relax and take a break from her studies. Elena agreed. The party was held in an apartment in the center of Sverdlovsk, in an old building with high ceilings and stucco moldings. The apartment was huge, with expensive furniture and imported appliances. For those times, it was a luxury available only to the children of the nomenklatura. There were about 15 people at the party, young people between the ages of 20 and 25, well-dressed and self-confident. They drank imported alcohol, smoked foreign cigarettes, laughed loudly, and discussed where they had vacationed that summer: Crimea, Sochi, and Bulgaria. Elena felt out of place. These people were from another world, the sons of factory directors, party officials, and high-ranking military officers. They looked at her condescendingly, as if she were a curiosity, a girl from a working-class family who had stumbled into their company by accident. The classmate who had brought Elena quickly disappeared into one of the rooms with a young man, leaving her alone. Elena wanted to leave, but it was already late. Around 11 p.m., there was no transportation, and the dormitory closed at midnight. She decided to wait for her classmate, sat in a corner, drank tea, and tried not to attract attention. But she did attract attention. 3 young men sat down next to her, started talking, and offered her a drink. She refused. They insisted, became intrusive, grabbed her by the arms and waist. Elena tried to leave, but they blocked the exit, dragged her into one of the rooms, and locked the door. Even 20 years later, Elena could not remember what happened next without feeling physical pain. The 3 men took turns raping her for several hours. She screamed, but the music drowned out her cries. She resisted, but they were stronger. When they were done, one of them, tall, blonde, with cold blue eyes, said to her calmly, almost friendly, if she went to the police, she would be expelled from school, her parents would be fired from their jobs, and she herself could be accused of prostitution. They had connections, money, and power. No one would believe her. It was better to forget and move on. Elena left the apartment around 4 in the morning. She walked through the night city to her dormitory, more than 5 kilometers. It was cold. It was snowing. She was wearing a light jacket and no hat. She made it to the dormitory, sneaked in through a basement window, and went up to her room. She locked herself in, lay down on the bed without undressing. She lay there until morning, not crying, not moving, just staring at the ceiling. She didn't go to the police. She didn't go to the hospital. She didn't tell anyone, not even her parents. She continued her studies as if nothing had happened. She took exams, practiced, and smiled when necessary. But something inside her broke. Something went out forever. She stopped trusting people, stopped feeling joy, and stopped making plans for the future. She lived mechanically, doing what was necessary, but not really living. The classmate who brought her to the party tried to talk to her a week later. She apologized, saying she didn't know it would turn out that way, that the guys were joking around. Elena looked at her coldly and said, "Don't come near me again." Her classmate backed off. They never spoke again. Elena graduated from college in 1980. She was assigned to City Maternity Hospital No. 3. She started working. Work became her refuge, a place where she could control the situation, where she was respected, where she felt useful. She helped women give birth, saw a new life come into the world, and this gave her existence some meaning. But the rage did not go away. It accumulated, grew, and turned into an obsession. Elena thought about those 3 men every day. She tried to find them, to learn their names, but she couldn't. She only remembered their faces, their voices, the atmosphere of the apartment. She understood that she would never be able to find them, never be able to punish them. The system, money, and connections protected them. They lived their lives, probably without even remembering her. Perhaps they had wives, children, careers. They were happy, protected, untouchable. And then Elena made a decision. If she couldn't get to them, she would get to their entourage, their wives, their daughters, their mistresses, the women who benefited from their money, their power, their protection, who lived in luxury, unaware of the price that had been paid for it, who came to give birth in elite maternity hospitals through their connections, expecting the best service and the best conditions. It was the logic of a sick, twisted mind. But for Elena, it was perfectly rational. Working in maternity hospital No. 3, Elena quickly understood how the system worked. Ordinary women gave birth in shared wards, with minimal comfort, often without pain relief, and with rude treatment from overworked staff. But there were others, those who arrived on a call from above, who were placed in private wards, who were provided with the best doctors, imported medicines, and extra attention. These were the wives of factory directors who, in the early 1990s, became owners of privatized enterprises. The wives of generals and colonels of the Ural Military District, the spouses of regional administration officials, the mistresses of businessmen who were beginning to build their empires on the ruins of the USSR, the daughters of party workers who deftly repainted themselves as Democrats and continued to hold power. Elena watched them with cold interest. She studied their manners, their conversations, their demands. They were self-confident, spoiled by attention, accustomed to having their wishes fulfilled immediately. They complained about inconveniences that ordinary women in labor would consider a luxury. They demanded exceptional food, special care, special treatment. And Elena saw in each of them a continuation of those who had ruined her life. Maybe they weren't directly to blame. Perhaps they didn't even know what their husbands had done in their youth. But they enjoyed the fruits of this system, where money and connections decided everything, where some could do whatever they wanted to others and get away with it. The selection of victims was methodical. Elena studied the incoming patients, read their charts, found out who their husbands were, what positions they held, and what connections they had. She chose those whose husbands were influential enough, but not so much that they would cause too much of a fuss if problems arose. A mid-level general, a factory director with several thousand employees, a deputy head of administration, high enough status to arouse Elena's hatred, but not so high that the incident would attract the attention of the prosecutor's office or the FSB. It was also crucial that the births be difficult enough. First births, women over 35, multiple pregnancies, breech presentations, and weak labor. In such cases, complications would seem natural, and the medical commission would attribute everything to objective circumstances. Elena did not rush. She chose her first victim only 12 years after her own trauma, in 1992. She was 33 years old, already an experienced midwife, knew all the intricacies of the job, and had access to medicines, medical protocols, and confidential information. The first case occurred in March 1992. A 37-year-old woman, the wife of the director of a large machine-building plant, was admitted to the maternity hospital. It was her first pregnancy, and the delivery was complicated. Weak labor, large fetus. Elena Martinova was on duty. The delivery lasted more than 12 hours and required stimulation and pain relief. The baby was born healthy, a boy weighing 3,800 grams. But 2 hours after giving birth, the woman began to complain of numbness in her legs. Then she lost feeling in her hands. Then she stopped moving altogether. A neurologist was called, and an examination was carried out. The picture resembled a stroke or spinal cord injury. Tests showed changes in the blood, but the cause could not be determined. The woman was transferred to intensive care and connected to a ventilator. A week later, she died. A medical commission conducted an investigation. The conclusion: complications from childbirth, cerebral thrombosis caused by stress, and blood loss. No medical errors were found. The deceased woman's husband made a fuss, demanding that the doctors be punished, but the commission was adamant. The birth record was flawless, all procedures were performed correctly, and medications were administered according to instructions. It was simply a tragic coincidence. The second case occurred in August of the same year. The patient was the 34-year-old wife of a military prosecutor. It was her second childbirth, but there were complications: gystosis and high blood pressure. Elena was on duty again. The delivery went relatively smoothly, and the baby girl was born healthy. But the next day, the new mother woke up paralyzed. She could not move her arms or legs, and her speech was slurred. A neurologist diagnosed massive damage to the spinal cord of unknown etiology. The woman survived, but was confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. Her husband, a colonel in the prosecutor's office, conducted his own investigation, questioned all the doctors and nurses, and demanded the exhumation of medical waste and the inspection of medicines. But he found nothing. The records were clean, all procedures were documented, and witnesses confirmed that the delivery had proceeded without complications. The commission again issued its verdict: a rare complication, individual intolerance, no medical error. The third case occurred in February 1993. the 29-year-old daughter of the deputy head of the regional administration. First birth, young, healthy girl. Pregnancy went normally, but the birth was prolonged and required stimulation. Elena was on duty. The baby was born healthy, but 4 hours later, the mother fell into a coma. The doctors fought for 3 days, but they couldn't save her. Death was caused by respiratory and cardiac arrest. The father of the deceased, an influential official, used all his connections to get to the bottom of the matter. He invited experts from Moscow and demanded an autopsy and analysis of all the drugs used during childbirth. The examination lasted a month. The result: death was caused by a severe allergic reaction to one of the drugs used to stimulate labor. A rare case that could not have been foreseen. The doctors acted according to protocol. No one was to blame. The 4th, 5th, and 6th cases followed at intervals of several months. Always different women, different circumstances, but the same midwife was on duty during childbirth. Always complications that seemed natural, but led to paralysis or death. Medical commissions threw up their hands. Experts theorized about rare pathologies, statistical anomalies, and bad luck. No one wanted to admit the obvious, that a killer was working in the maternity hospital, because that would mean scandal, the institution's closure, criminal cases against the management, and inspections by the Ministry of Health and the prosecutor's office. It was easier to blame it all on medical errors or tragic coincidences. By the end of 1995, Elena Martinova was involved in the death or disability of 9 women. 9 wives, daughters, or mistresses of influential people. 9 cases that went unpunished because no one wanted to dig deeper. The investigation later reconstructed the method Elena used. It was simple, effective, and left virtually no evidence. Elena used Soviet pharmaceuticals that were rarely used by the 1990s, but were still stored in the maternity hospital's utility rooms. These were drugs developed in the 1950s and 1960s with substantial side effects, which were later replaced by safer analogs. But they were not disposed of. They were simply put away in distant cupboards where they gathered dust for years. One of these drugs was an old-generation muscle relaxant, which in large doses caused paralysis of the respiratory muscles and could lead to respiratory arrest. Another was a vasoconstrictor, which in the wrong dosage caused thrombosis and stroke. The third was an anesthetic that, when administered into the spinal canal in a specific concentration, caused irreversible damage to nerve endings. Elena had access to these drugs. As a senior midwife, she was responsible for keeping track of the drugs and could take them without asking any questions. She knew how to use them, in what doses, and at what times. During childbirth, when the woman in labor was in a state of stress, pain, and fatigue, and when the attention of doctors and nurses was focused on the baby, Elena administered the drug. Sometimes through an IV, adding it to the leading solution. Sometimes through an injection in the back, masking it as epidural anesthesia. Sometimes through an intravenous catheter, which every woman in labor has. The drug did not take effect immediately. It took an hour, 2 hours, sometimes several hours. By this time, the birth was already over. Elena handed the patient over to other nurses and left her shift. When complications arose, she was already at home or in another department. It was impossible to connect her with the incident. Elena filled out the birth records flawlessly. She recorded all procedures and all drugs administered, but only those that were officially approved. No mention of old Soviet drugs, no records of additional injections. If any of her colleagues saw her injecting something, she would explain that it was vitamins, glucose, or painkillers. No one checked. No one suspected anything. Psychologically, Elena acted coldly, without emotion. She did not enjoy killing, did not sit at the bedside of the dying to revel in their suffering. It was not sadism. It was the execution of a sentence. In her distorted perception, she was restoring justice. Each paralyzed or dead woman was payment for what had happened to her at the age of 20. She did not kill the innocent. She killed those who were guilty by association. The wives of those who belonged to the class of rapists, exploiters, and those who used their power with impunity. Elena kept count. In a notebook she kept at home, in a laundry drawer, she wrote down dates, names, and results. Not details, just numbers, initials, outcomes like an accountant keeping track of work done. By the end of 1995, there were 9 entries in the notebook. Everything changed in December 1995, when another patient was admitted to the maternity hospital, the 35-year-old wife of a major general in the Ural military district. It was her second childbirth, but she was no longer young, so there were risks. The woman was admitted on orders from above, placed in the best ward, and assigned the best doctors. Elena Martinova was on duty. She studied the patient's chart and learned who her husband was, a major general, commander of an artillery brigade, hero of Afghanistan, recipient of orders, the perfect victim. Elena decided to act. The birth went smoothly, without any complications. The boy was born healthy, weighing 3.5 kilos. The new mother felt well, was conscious, talked to her husband on the phone, and was happy. Elena administered the drug through an IV an hour before the end of her shift. Everything was as usual. She handed the patient over to the next shift and went home. But this time, something went wrong. 2 hours after Elena left, the new mother began to complain of numbness in her legs. The nurse on duty called the doctor. The doctor examined her, became concerned, and called a neurologist. The neurologist diagnosed incipient paralysis and ordered the patient to be transferred to intensive care immediately. In intensive care, they connected her to all possible equipment: a ventilator, IVs with anticoagulants, and drugs to maintain blood pressure. The doctors fought all night. By morning, her condition had stabilized. The paralysis did not progress. The woman remained alive and conscious, but she could not move her legs. The victim's husband, a major general, arrived at the maternity hospital an hour after the complications began. He was furious. He demanded explanations, yelled at the doctors, and threatened a military tribunal. The chief physician tried to calm him down, explaining that this was a rare complication and that the doctors had done everything possible. The general would not listen. He called Moscow, contacted an acquaintance in the prosecutor general's office, and demanded an immediate investigation. The next day, a commission from Moscow arrived at the maternity hospital. Investigators from the prosecutor general's office, medical experts, and specialists in medical crimes. They seized all medical records for the past 5 years, birth records, and medication logs. They interviewed all the staff, including cleaners and nurses. They checked all the utility rooms, medicine cabinets, and medical waste storage areas. And they began to find strange things. It turned out that over the past 3 years, there had been 9 cases of death or severe disability among women giving birth at the maternity hospital, 10 times higher than the national average. All 9 cases occurred during the shift of the same midwife, Elena Martinova. All 9 patients were wives or daughters of influential people. All 9 cases were attributed to medical complications without detailed investigation. Investigators reviewed the birth records for all 9 cases. The records were perfect. All procedures were documented. All medications were recorded. And all signatures were in place. But experts noticed one detail. In each record, there was a small time gap of 5 to 10 minutes when the midwife was alone with the woman in labor, without witnesses. Officially, this time was allocated to hygiene procedures, linen changes, and preparation for transfer to the postpartum ward. But it was during these minutes, as the experts' calculations showed, that an additional substance could have been administered. The medicine storage room was checked. In a faraway cabinet, which was rarely opened, old Soviet-made drugs were found, with expired shelf lives, which should have been disposed of back in the 1980s. Among them were muscle relaxants, vasoconstrictors, and old-generation anesthetics. The logbook showed that the amount of these drugs had decreased over the past 3 years. Someone had been taking them, but there were no entries in the logbook. Elena Martinova had the key to this cabinet. As the senior midwife, she was responsible for tracking all drugs in the department. No one else had access to it. On 23 December 1995, Elena Martinova was detained right at her workplace. She was coming on duty, putting on her gown in the locker room, when 2 investigators and 3 police officers entered. They showed her an arrest warrant. Elena did not resist, did not try to run away, did not scream. She took off her gown, put on her coat, and went with them, silently. The interrogation lasted 8 hours. Elena sat in the investigator's office. Opposite her was the prosecutor's investigator. Next to her was the court reporter, and in the corner was the stenographer. On the table was a stack of medical records, photographs of dead and paralyzed women, and medication logs. The investigator asked questions methodically and calmly. Elena answered just as calmly, without emotion. She did not deny anything. She did not try to justify herself. She did not come up with stories about medical errors or tragic coincidences. She told the truth. Yes, it was her. Yes, she administered drugs that caused paralysis or death. Yes, she did it intentionally, planning every action. No, she has no regrets. No, she does not consider herself a criminal. She was restoring justice. The investigator asked, "Why these women in particular? Did they personally do something bad to her?" Elena replied, "No, they hadn't done anything to her personally, but they were the wives of those who belonged to the class of rapists. They enjoyed the money obtained through power and violence. They lived in luxury, while others suffered. They were part of the system that allowed 3 men to rape her and go unpunished." The investigator asked her to describe the rape. Elena recounted it dryly, without details, as if she were talking about someone else. She described the party, the apartment, and the 3 men. The investigator asked if she had tried to find these men. Elena replied that she had tried for the first few years, but she couldn't. They disappeared into the elite crowd, protected by their connections and money. And then she realized that she needed to target not them, but those around them. The investigator asked the question that tormented everyone. How did she choose her victims? Elena explained her method. She studied the files of incoming patients, found out who their husbands were, and what positions they held. She chose those who were influential enough, but not too much. Those whose births were promised to be difficult, so that complications would seem natural. Those who came in on a call from above, expecting special treatment. The investigator asked if she felt guilty. Elena thought for a moment, then replied, "No." She felt satisfaction. Every time another woman died or was left paralyzed, Elena believed that the balance was being restored, that her pain was at least partially compensated for. The system that protected rapists was now losing its own. The investigator asked one last question. Did she plan to stop? Elena looked at him coldly and said no. She would only stop when she herself died, or when there were no happy families left among the elite. The interrogation was over. Elena was sent for a psychiatric evaluation. The experts worked for 2 weeks. The result? Sane. She was aware of the nature of her actions and could control them. She has post-traumatic stress disorder, which developed after the rape, and has an obsessive desire for revenge. But this does not deprive her of the ability to be responsible for her actions. It was recommended that she be found guilty and punished in accordance with the criminal code of the Russian Federation. The trial of Elena Martinova began in March 1996. They tried not to publicize the trial. There were too many high-profile names among the victims. There were too many uncomfortable questions about why no one had noticed the series of deaths earlier, why medical commissions had turned a blind eye to the obvious, and why influential families had been unable to protect their wives and daughters. The hearings were held behind closed doors, journalists were not allowed in, and relatives of the deceased were advised not to discuss the case. The official press version was vague. A medical worker was accused of abusing authority, leading to serious consequences. There was no mention of serial murders, revenge, or past rape. The prosecutor demanded the maximum punishment, 25 years imprisonment for the totality of the crimes. 9 episodes of intentional infliction of grievous bodily harm resulting in death or disability, aggravating circumstances, particular cruelty, exploitation of the helpless state of the victims, multiple crimes. The defense tried to play on Elena's psychological trauma. The lawyer, a young woman appointed to the case, said that her client was herself a victim, that the rape had broken her psyche, that she needed treatment rather than punishment. She asked the court to take into account mitigating circumstances and to order compulsory treatment in a psychiatric hospital instead of a prison colony. But the court was unyielding. Elena Martinova committed 9 serious crimes, aware of their nature, planning each action, covering her tracks. She did not act in the heat of the moment. She did not lose control. She methodically killed over a period of 3 years. Her trauma cannot serve as an excuse. Elena Martinova's story shocked the Russian medical community. How could this have happened? How could a midwife who had dedicated her life to helping women and newborns turn into a cold-blooded killer? How did the control system allow 9 deaths in a row without investigation? After the trial, large-scale inspections of all maternity hospitals in the Sverdlovsk region were carried out. Control over the accounting of medicines was tightened. Mandatory video surveillance was introduced in delivery rooms, and protocols requiring the presence of 2 medical workers during any procedures involving women in labor were changed. The chief physician of Maternity Hospital No. 3 was dismissed, and several department heads were demoted. The maternity hospital was closed for 6 months for reorganization. But the changes in the system did not bring back the lives of those who died or restore the health of those who were paralyzed. 9 families were left with pain, emptiness, and the question, why? Elena Martinova is serving her sentence in a women's correctional colony in the Perm region. Her fellow inmates treat her with caution. Even among criminals, the murder of defenseless women and the deprivation of children of their mothers is considered despicable. She has been beaten several times and once had boiling water poured on her. The colony administration transferred her to an isolated cell for her own safety. Elena has no regrets. According to prison psychologists, she still considers her actions to be justified. She says that the only thing she regrets is that she was unable to find and punish the 3 men who raped her. Everything else, in her opinion, was a necessary balance. The 3 rapists were never found. The investigation tried to establish their identities based on Elena's descriptions, but too many years had passed. The apartment where the rape took place changed owners several times. The classmate who brought Elena to the party died of cancer in 1992. There were no other witnesses. Perhaps those 3 men are still alive somewhere, unaware that their crime 30 years ago led to the deaths of 9 innocent women. Elena will spend 23 years in prison. 9 women will never return to life. 9 children grew up without mothers. The 3 rapists who started it all went unpunished. And somewhere in the archives lies a file marked "Secret" that tells this terrible story. A story of quiet revenge that lasted for years and took too many lives. 3 men were found dead at dawn on 18 November 1995 on the grounds of an abandoned brick factory in the village of Krasny Mayak in the Tula region, which the workers who came for scrap metal saw will never be forgotten. The bodies were sitting on metal rods protruding from the ground, like scarecrows in a vegetable garden. But these were not scarecrows. These were people, and their death had been long and painful. The police knew who they were. Local rumor knew what they had done. And the quiet guard in a wheelchair, who was the last to see them alive, remained silent. And in that silence was the truth that no one dared to speak aloud. The village of Krasny Mayak never appeared in guidebooks. Located 28 kilometers from Tula, it grew up around the brick factory named after the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the 1950s. The factory operated smoothly until the early 1990s, providing jobs for almost the entire village, about 800 people. Then the collapse began: privatization, unpaid wages, and layoffs. By 1994, the factory had shut down for good. The equipment was taken away for scrap metal, the buildings fell into disrepair, and the area became overgrown with weeds. But the people stayed. There was nowhere to go. Apartments in the city cost money that no one had, and there were no jobs there either. The village slowly died. The store was open every other day, the school closed, and the bus to the city ran once a day. People survived as best they could. Vegetable gardens, moonshine, odd jobs, and crime. In the village, everyone always knew each other. 800 people are not enough to get lost in a city. Here, everyone knew who drank, who stole, and who beat his wife. And everyone knew the Klimov-Zorin family, who lived in a 2-story barracks at number 5 on Zavodskaya Street. Raisa Klimova, 42, worked as a cleaner at the village administration. She was a small, thin woman with tired eyes and a headscarf that was always tied. She had been a widow since 1987, when her first husband, Vasily Klimov, died in a drunken brawl outside a store. She raised her daughter, Inna, alone on a salary of 130 rubles, which was often delayed for months. In 1992, Raisa married for the second time to Arkady Zorin, 47 years old, a disabled person of the second group. Until 1989, Arkady worked as a miner at the Lenin coal mine in a neighboring district. On 23 March 1989, a collapse occurred in pit number 6. 4 people died, and 3 more were pulled out crippled. Arkady was among the survivors. His spine was broken in 2 places. His legs were paralyzed below the waist. A wheelchair became his only means of transportation. He married Raisa not out of great love. They were both lonely and needed support. He received a pension of 180 rubles and she received a salary. Together, they somehow survived. Arkady was a quiet man. He didn't drink or cause any trouble. He read books he borrowed from the village library and did odd jobs around the house, repairing stools and making photo frames. Neighbors said he was quiet, but not mean, just withdrawn. A man who had accepted his fate and resigned himself to it. Inna Klimova, Raisa's daughter from her first marriage, was 18 years old in 1995. A blonde, blue-eyed girl, she graduated from the local 8-year school and enrolled in the Tula Pedagogical College as a part-time student. She worked as a saleswoman in the village store, earning pennies, but wanted to become an elementary school teacher. She dreamed of leaving the village, finding a job in the city, and renting a room. Her neighbors described her as a quiet, well-mannered girl. She didn't smoke or drink and rarely went to discos at the village club. But there were others in the village, those who didn't work, didn't study, and had no plans to do so. Those for whom the 1990s became a time of impunity. Gennady Shlikov, 24, was the oldest of the 3. He was a tall, strong guy with a bull neck and small eyes. He had a criminal record for hooliganism in 1988, a year's probation. Then another for fighting, 1991, 6 months in prison. He came out angry and dangerous. He didn't work anywhere, lived with his retired mother, drank and caused trouble. His fellow villagers feared him. He beat people brutally, indiscriminately. The local police officer wrote up reports, but nothing came of it. Vitaly Krivoshein, 22 years old, was smaller and more cunning. He worked as a stoker in a boiler room, but drank away his salary in 2 days. He had no criminal record, but he was part of the village's criminal underworld. He helped sell stolen goods, knew where to get vodka after the store closed, and knew how to negotiate with the police. He lived with his alcoholic father in a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. Stepan Korobov, 20 years old, was the youngest and the dumbest, a big guy with a baby face and slow speech. He dropped out of school after 6th grade and worked as a loader at a truck depot until it closed, then nowhere. He lived with his sister and her husband, who couldn't stand him. On the street, he stuck close to Shlikov and did whatever he told him to do. Fellow villagers said that Stepan wasn't evil, just stupid and easily influenced. This trio was well known in the village. They drank together, caused trouble together, and robbed drunk people together. The local police officer, Senior Lieutenant Sergei Mokov, wrote up reports on them and opened cases, but they rarely went to trial. Witnesses refused to testify, victims withdrew their statements, and evidence disappeared. In the 90s, this was the norm. The night of October 15th at 16, 1995, changed everything. Inna Klimova was returning home around 11 p.m. She had stayed late at school for a pedagogy consultation, then waited for a bus that was 40 minutes late. When she got off the bus at the village bus stop, it was dark and cold. The October wind blew fallen leaves along the deserted streets. The streetlights were not working. The electricity had been cut off in September due to unpaid bills. It was about 800 meters from the bus stop to her house. Inna walked quickly, clutching her bag of textbooks. Halfway there, near the abandoned building of a former store, someone called out to her. 3 men emerged from the darkness: Shlikov, Krivoshein, and Korobov, all drunk, staggering, with red eyes. Shlikov asked where she was in such a hurry. Inna tried to get around them, but Korobov blocked her way. They surrounded her. She told her mother and the local police officer what happened next, only 2 days later, when she was able to speak. They grabbed her and dragged her into the basement of the abandoned store. There, in the stinking darkness among the garbage and rat droppings, they took turns raping her. She screamed, but no one heard her, or didn't want to listen to her. When they were done, Shlikov threatened her. He said that if she told anyone, they would come back, and not just to her mother, too. Inna lay in the basement, unable to move, until they left, laughing loudly and discussing where to go next. She got home at 3 in the morning. Raisa opened the door and didn't recognize her daughter. Her face was beaten, her clothes torn, her eyes empty. Inna fell into her mother's arms and began to sob. Arkady, sitting in his wheelchair in the room, heard the crying and rolled out into the hallway. He saw his stepdaughter and understood everything without words. Raisa wanted to call the police right away, but Inna begged her not to. She said she was afraid they would come back and kill them. Raisa insisted. In the end, they did not call the local police officer until the morning of 16th October. Senior Lieutenant Sergei Mokov, 41 years old, arrived around noon. He recorded Inna's testimony and examined her injuries: bruises on her face, neck and thighs, and abrasions on her wrists. He sent her to the district hospital for a medical examination. Paramedic Tamara Sidorova recorded signs of violent sexual intercourse, multiple bruises, and abrasions. She took swabs for analysis. Mokov opened a criminal case under Article 131 of the RSFSR Criminal Code: gang rape. He detained all 3 on the same day. Shlikov, Krivoshein, and Korobov denied everything. They said they were at home that evening, which witnesses would confirm. Shlikov's mother swore that her son was with her all evening, watching television. Krivoshein's father said the same thing. Korobov's sister provided an alibi for her younger brother, but there were other witnesses. Their neighbor, Nina Fyodorovna Gracheva, saw Inna walking from the bus stop and saw the 3 men following her. It was around 11:20 p.m. She was looking out the window and saw everything. She gave her testimony to the local police officer. Another witness was Pyotr Ignatov, a 62-year-old pensioner and former factory mechanic. He was returning late from a friend's house, where he had been playing dominoes. He was passing by an abandoned store around midnight and heard screams coming from the basement. Women's screams. He wanted to go in and see, but he was afraid. He thought it was a drunken brawl. Later, he regretted not intervening. He also gave testimony. A medical examination confirmed the rape. Swabs were sent to the regional laboratory for DNA analysis, but the results could take several months. In 1995, such analyses were slow. Mokov was convinced of the three's guilt. He collected testimony and medical documents and sent the case to the district prosecutor's office. But a week later, he received a response. The case was returned for further investigation. There was insufficient evidence. The suspect's alibis had not been thoroughly refuted. The witness statements were contradictory. Mokov tried to argue. He called the prosecutor's office and wrote reports. But the district prosecutor, Oleg Viktorovich Semyonov, was adamant. The case was weak, he said. It would fall apart in court. Direct evidence is needed. DNA analysis, identification in a lineup, and confessions. Until then, the suspects cannot be held in custody. On 23rd of October, all three were released. The preventive measure was a written pledge not to leave the city. The case was left open, but in fact, it was suspended. When Raisa found out about this, she came to the police station and made a scene. She yelled at Mokov, demanding justice. Mokov threw up his hands. "There's nothing I can do," he said. "It's the prosecutor's decision." Raisa went to the prosecutor. Semenov received her, listened to her, but his answer was the same. "Wait for the DNA test results," he said. "If they confirm their guilt, we will reopen the case and put them in jail. But the results could take 3 months to come back, or 6 months, or they might not come back at all. The laboratory in Tula was working intermittently, and funding was delayed, and the 3 men were walking free. The village of Krasny Mayak was divided. Some believed in Inna and sympathized with her family. Others whispered that maybe she was to blame, that she had been out late and dressed provocatively. Others were afraid to speak out. Shlikov and his friends were dangerous people. Inna stopped leaving the house. She quit her job at the store and dropped out of school. She sat in her room, not eating or sleeping. The doctor at the local hospital prescribed her sedatives, but they didn't help. Raisa tried to support her, but she herself was on the verge of a breakdown. She also stopped working. The administration fired her under the pretext of staff reductions. Arkady watched all this in silence. He was a quiet man, but something was changing inside him. Neighbors later said that he became even more withdrawn. He would sit by the window for hours, staring at the street. He wrote something in a notebook. No one knew what exactly. The notebook was never found. At the end of October, Arkady got a job as a night watchman at an abandoned factory. The job was unofficial. The village administration, which formally managed the factory grounds after it went bankrupt, paid him 1,000 rubles a month in cash. His job was simply to be on the premises at night, to scare off looters stealing scrap metal and bricks. It was a strange job for a wheelchair user, but Arkady insisted. Raisa tried to talk him out of it. "How will you manage there?" she said. "You can't walk." He replied that he would manage, that he needed the money, that sitting at home and going crazy was worse. The administration agreed. They gave him the keys to the gatehouse and the guardhouse, a small brick house at the main gate of the factory. There was a stove, a cot, a table, and electricity from a generator. Arkady arrived in his wheelchair at 10 in the evening and stayed until 6 in the morning. Then he would return home. The first 2 weeks of November passed quietly. Arkady conscientiously performed his duties. Several times he chased away looters. Teenagers tried to steal metal, but when they saw the guard, they ran away. There were no incidents, but in the village, something else was happening. Shlikov, Krivoshein, and Korobov did not hide. On the contrary, they demonstratively appeared on the streets, drank outside the store, and laughed loudly. Several times they walked past Raisa's house, looked into the windows, and exchanged remarks. Raisa complained to the local police officer, but Mokov could not do anything. Formally, they were not breaking any laws. Once, on 9th November, Shlikov met Raisa at the store. He approached her closely, leaning over her, and said quietly so that no one could hear, "Tell your daughter that we remember her, that we haven't forgotten her." Raisa ran home in tears. That night, Arkady silently got ready for work and left for his shift. No one will ever know what he felt or thought. He left no diaries and confided no plans. But something in him broke completely. On the morning of 18th November 1995, two workers, Igor Matveyev and Semyon Kuznetsov, both around 40 years old, arrived at the factory grounds to collect scrap metal. They had agreed with the administration that they could take old pipes from workshop number 3. They arrived early, around 7 in the morning, so that they could finish before dark. They entered the premises through a hole in the fence. The main gate was locked, and they didn't want to call the guard. They walked through the old foundry, taking a shortcut to workshop number 3. And then they saw them. In the open area between the workshops, where stacks of bricks had once stood, metal pins protruded from the ground, long reinforcing bars driven into the ground at an angle. A person sat on each one, or rather, what was left of them. The bodies were impaled on the rods through the crotch, with the rebar protruding from the chest or shoulder area. Their arms and legs were not tied. They just hung there. Their faces were contorted in death throes, their eyes open, their mouths open in a silent scream. Kuznetsov screamed and ran back to the hole in the fence. Matveyev stood there, unable to look away, then vomited on the spot. Then he ran too. They ran to the village administration, shouting and waving their arms. The head of the administration, Viktor Petrovich Gryaznov, did not believe them at first. He thought they were drunk or had gone mad. But when both of them kept swearing, he called the police. Local police officer Mokov and 2 police officers from the district department arrived half an hour later. They entered the factory grounds through the main gate. The guardhouse was locked from the inside, and Arkady was not there. They went into the grounds. When Mokov saw the bodies, he stopped dead in his tracks. Then he slowly approached. He identified all 3. Gennady Shlikov, Vitaly Krivoshein, Stepan Korobov, all dead. All impaled on rebar, traces of struggle, blood, torment. Mokov called for backup, a task force, an investigator. They cordoned off the area. They began their investigation. The district prosecutor's investigator, Andrei Nikolaevich Belov, 44 years old, arrived at 11 in the morning. He was an experienced investigator who had been to Afghanistan and seen death in many forms. But even he admitted later that he had never seen anything like this before. The investigation revealed the following. All 3 were alive when they were impaled on the pins. This was evident from the bloodstains around them, the characteristic damage to their internal organs, and the position of their bodies. Death was caused by pain, shock, and blood loss. The process of dying took from several hours to a day. It was not possible to determine more precisely. The rebar rods had been driven into the ground beforehand. Their diameter was about 20 millimeters, and their length was about 2.5 meters. One end was sharpened with a file. They had been driven in with a sledgehammer or hammer, deep, about 50 centimeters. The victims were forcibly hoisted onto the rods. There were drag marks, blood stains, and scraps of clothing on the ground around them. There were rope marks on the victims' hands and feet. They were tied up, hoisted up, impaled, then untied, and left to die. The time of death was approximately between 11 p.m. on 17th November and 4 a.m. on 18th November. It was not possible to determine the exact time. Investigator Belov inspected the guardhouse. The door was locked from the inside with a bolt. The door was broken down. Inside, it was empty. There were no signs of a struggle. On the table was a thermos with cold tea and an uneaten sandwich. On the cot was a crumpled blanket. Everything looked as if Arkady had gone out to patrol the territory and had not returned. But his wheelchair was standing by the guardhouse, empty. They began to search for Arkady. They searched the entire factory grounds, 20 hectares of workshops, warehouses, basements, and pipes. They didn't find him. They searched the surrounding area. They called in all the local police, the district police, and volunteers from the village. They combed the forest around the factory, the fields, and the ravines. Arkady Zorin was nowhere to be found. The search of Raisa Klimova's home was conducted on the same day, 18th November, at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Investigator Belov, local police officer Mokov, and 2 operatives entered the apartment with a warrant. Raisa was at home with her daughter, Inna. Both were pale, frightened, and did not understand what was happening. Belov explained as briefly as possible. "Your husband, Arkady Zorin, is wanted on suspicion of triple murder. The bodies of Shlikov, Krivoshein, and Korobov were found on the premises of the factory, where they worked as security guards. He himself has disappeared. A search must be conducted." Raisa turned even paler. She sank into a chair, unable to stand. Inna didn't say a word, just stared at the floor. The search lasted 2 hours. They turned everything upside down. Wardrobes, beds, kitchen drawers, the crawl space. They confiscated Arkady's clothes, his personal belongings, and his documents. They were looking for weapons, traces of blood, anything that would link him to the murder. They found nothing. The only thing that aroused their interest was the absence of Arkady's work clothes. Raisa said that he had an old sweatshirt and cotton pants that he wore on duty. They were not in the house, so he had left for work wearing them and had not returned. Belov questioned Raisa. She told him everything she knew, that Arkady had left for his shift on the evening of 17th November, as usual, at 10 p.m. She helped him down the stairs at the entrance in his wheelchair. There was no elevator in the house, so he always went down with someone's help or carried it down himself. Then he rolled down the street to the factory, a distance of about 1 kilometer, which he covered in 15 to 20 minutes. In the morning, he was supposed to return at 6, as always, but he didn't return. Belov asked about Arkady's condition in recent days. Raisa thought for a moment. She said that he had become very quiet. He hardly spoke. He sat by the window and looked out at the street. Once she asked him what he was thinking about. He replied, "About justice." He didn't explain anything else. Inna was questioned separately. She repeated what her mother had said. She added only one detail. The day before yesterday, on 16th November, Arkady asked her to come to him. He said quietly, so that her mother wouldn't hear, "Don't be afraid. Everything will be fine." It would all be over soon. Inna didn't understand what he meant. She decided that he just wanted to reassure her. The neighbors in the building were questioned. They confirmed that they had seen Arkady leaving for his shift on the evening of the 17th. Nothing unusual, just a regular work shift. Arkady's acquaintances were questioned, but there weren't many. He was a loner and had no friends. Sometimes he played chess with his neighbor, Nikolai Petrovich Savin. Savin said that Arkady was an intelligent, calm person. He never complained about life, even though fate had not been kind to him. After the incident with Inna, he became even quieter. But Savin did not see any malice in him. At the same time, the investigation was looking into the circumstances of the murder of the 3 men. They questioned everyone who could have seen Shlikov, Krivoshein, and Korobov on 17th November. They were last seen together around 9 p.m. near a store. They were drinking vodka while sitting on a bench. The store clerk, Olga Vasilyevna Krotova, confirmed that they bought 3 bottles of vodka and a pack of cigarettes from her around 8 p.m. They were noisy, but not aggressive. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, a man approached them. The witness, Pyotr Ivanovich Golubev, 56 years old, unemployed, saw this from the window of his house. The man was in a wheelchair. He was short and dressed in dark clothes. He drove up to the bench and said something to the three of them. Golubev did not hear the conversation. He only saw it. The conversation lasted 2 or 3 minutes. Then the three got up and followed the wheelchair. They walked towards the factory. Golubev did not think much of it. He believed that the disabled man had asked for help carrying or repairing something. This happened sometimes. Arkady sometimes asked the locals for help. That was the last thing anyone saw. No one saw the three alive again. The investigation yielded a theory. Arkady Zorin, knowing that the 3 rapists of his stepdaughter had gone unpunished, decided to take revenge. He lured them to the factory premises under some pretext. Perhaps he promised them alcohol, which he allegedly hid in one of the workshops, or money, something that would interest drunk, marginalized people. They came, and fell into a trap. How exactly a disabled man in a wheelchair was able to overcome 3 healthy men was the main question. The investigation suggested several options. The first was outside help. Maybe Arkady had an accomplice, someone strong who could help tie up and immobilize the victims. But no traces of another person were found at the crime scene. All shoe prints matched either the victims or Arkady. The second possibility was a weapon. Maybe Arkady threatened them with a rifle or a pistol. He forced them to lie down on the ground and tied them up. But no gun was found. There were no traces of gunshots either. The third option is a trap. Maybe he lured them into a room where he had prepared a trap in advance. He locked them in there, then took them out one by one and executed them. But an inspection of all the rooms in the factory revealed no traces of the victims being held captive. A forensic expert expressed his opinion. He believed that the victims had been drugged or poisoned. Arkady could have mixed a strong sleeping pill into their vodka or food. When they lost consciousness or became weak, he tied them up. Then, one by one, he lifted them and impaled them on spikes. But analysis of the victims' stomach contents showed no toxins or sleeping pills, only vodka and food remnants. There was only one version left: the power of despair. Arkady was disabled, but he had strong arms. Years of wheelchair use developed the upper body. Maybe he took advantage of the element of surprise. He knocked out the first one with something heavy and tied him up. Then the second, the third. Drunk in the dark, in unfamiliar territory. They could have panicked. Investigator Belov leaned toward this version, but it was impossible to prove without Arkady's confession, and Arkady could not be found. The search continued for a week. They searched all the abandoned buildings in the village, all the ravines, all the forests within a 5-kilometer radius. They checked Arkady's relatives. There were a few of them, a sister in Tula and a cousin in Ryazan. Both said they hadn't seen Arkady in years and didn't know where he might be. They checked hospitals, morgues, train stations, and bus stations. They issued a search warrant for the region, then for the whole of Russia. A 47-year-old man, wheelchair-bound, wanted for triple murder. Nothing. On 25 November, exactly 1 week after the murder, workers dismantling the old boiler room at the factory found Arkady's wheelchair. It was standing in the boiler room's basement, empty. His work jacket lay nearby, neatly folded. They searched the basement. Nothing else. No traces, no blood, no notes. Investigator Belov put forward a theory that Arkady had committed suicide. After committing the murder, he realized there was no turning back. He left his wheelchair and clothes in the basement, then got out and went to die in the forest. Without his wheelchair, without his legs, in the November cold, he couldn't have gone far. He must have died of hypothermia within a few hours. A new search was organized, this time to find the body. They combed the forest around the factory, checking every ravine, every ditch. They brought in sniffer dogs. The dogs picked up a trail from the boiler room basement and led them north into the forest. They walked about 300 meters and lost the trail at a stream. Nothing further. The trail had broken off. They searched for another 2 weeks until mid-December. Then they stopped. Snow fell, and the temperature dropped to -15. If Arkady was ever alive, he was definitely dead now. The case of the murders of Shlikov, Krivoshine, and Korobov was closed. The culprit was identified as Arkady Zorin. The motive was revenge for the rape of his stepdaughter. The suspect himself was dead, presumably having committed suicide. The case was sent to the archives. The village of Krasny Mayak slowly digested what had happened. Opinions were radically divided. Some considered Arkady a hero. They said that he did what the police and the courts should have done, that the 3 rapists should have been punished, and if the law does not work, then a person has the right to defend their family themselves. These people did not condemn Arkady. Some even lit candles for him in church and prayed for his repose. Others considered him a murderer and a monster. They said that execution by impalement was barbaric, that even criminals did not deserve such a death, that Arkady himself had become a monster, worse than those he had killed. Others remained silent and afraid. They were worried that a precedent for vigilante justice had been set in the village. Now, anyone who considered themselves wronged could take the law into their own hands. The relatives of the victims demanded justice. Shlikov's mother filed a complaint with the regional prosecutor's office, demanding that the search for Arkady continue and that he be brought to trial. Krivoshine's father wrote to newspapers, accusing the police of inaction. Korobov's sister left the village altogether, unable to bear the shame. Raisa Klimova and Inna also became outcasts. Some pitied them, others condemned them, and still others feared them. Raisa lost her job for good and had no means of support. Inna did not leave the house for months. In January 1996, they left. They sold their apartment for pennies and moved to Raisa's sister in Ryazan. There, they said, they tried to start a new life. But the shadow of the past haunted them. Inna was never able to recover psychologically. Psychiatrists treated her, and she took antidepressants. In 1998, she committed suicide by jumping out of a high-rise window. She was 21 years old. Raisa outlived her daughter by 3 years. She died of a heart attack in 2001. She is buried next to Inna in the Ryazan cemetery. Investigator Belov, who led the case, gave an interview to a local newspaper in 2010. He said that he still does not know the whole truth, that the suicide version seems logical to him, but not entirely convincing. Too many questions remain unanswered. The main question is how a disabled person could physically commit such a murder, even taking into account the element of surprise, even taking into account that the victims were drunk. Lifting an adult man and impaling him on rebar requires enormous strength. Arkady had strong arms, but were they strong enough for this? Belov expressed a hypothesis that was not included in the official documents. He believed that Arkady used some mechanism, a winch, blocks, and a system of levers. That he had prepared everything in advance on the factory premises. He tied up the victims, then lifted them one by one mechanically, and impaled them on the pins. After the murder, he dismantled and hid the mechanism, but no traces of such a mechanism were found. They checked all the rooms in the factory and all the basements. Nothing. An expert psychologist who advised the investigation gave his assessment. He believed that Arkady Zorin was a man of tremendous inner willpower. Those years of physical suffering after his injury did not break him, but hardened him. He had learned to endure pain and overcome the limitations of his body. Revenge for his stepdaughter became his only goal, and this goal gave him strength that a disabled person should not have had. The psychologist also noted the symbolism of the execution. Impaling was an ancient method of execution used for traitors, betrayers, and rapists. Arkady chose this method for a reason. It was not just revenge. It was a trial, a sentence, the execution of a punishment that had to be public and demonstrative. Arkady wanted them to be found that way, so that everyone could see, so that everyone would understand he had passed sentence for the crime against his family and carried it out. That's all for now. If you liked the video and found it interesting, please like, subscribe, and write in the comments where you are listening to us from. See you in the next episode.